There was a time when darkness ruled the world. Not the kind we know today, the quiet dark behind curtains or the blue shadow of screens, but a darkness that lived and breathed. When the sun sank behind the horizon, light became a fragile, trembling thing. A single candle flame had to defend an entire room from the ancient void pressing against the walls. People did not fear monsters in the night. They feared the night itself. For when it came, it swallowed everything sound, sense, and certainty. Imagine standing in a field after sunset. The air grows heavy. The trees dissolve into silhouettes. The path home vanishes beneath your feet. In that moment, your heartbeat becomes the loudest sound in the world. You begin to understand why medieval villagers whispered prayers before nightfall, why they sealed windows, drew symbols on doors, and left offerings outside. The dark wasn't absence, it was presence. It crept, watched, listened, and everyone, no matter how faithful, wondered what waited beyond the firelight. In villages scattered across the cold countryside, life retreated after dusk. The streets emptied. Dogs curled beneath thresholds. Mothers checked the latch once, twice, sometimes 3 times. Candles burned low, their flames bending and shrinking, as though afraid of the night that pressed against them. The silence between the wind carried secrets, and every creak in the wood felt like breath from something unseen. Those who dared walk alone after midnight didn't hum songs, they whispered protection charms, hoping the words themselves might glow. Before light was captured in switches and glass, fear was woven into existence. The medieval night was a realm of uncertainty, and uncertainty demanded meaning. People looked for patterns in the dark, the flicker of a flame, the sound of an owl, the shadow that crossed the moon. To them, these weren't coincidences but messages. The world spoke in whispers, and survival meant learning its language. Belief wasn't a luxury, it was a form of navigation. It's easy for us, living in cities that never sleep, to forget what true night feels like. But in that older world, the boundary between the living and the unseen was thinner than parchment. The air after sunset belonged to another order, one where spirits, saints, and forgotten gods drifted through fog and firelight. To survive was to make peace with them, or at least pretend to. A pinch of salt on the sill, iron above the cradle, bread left on a doorstep, small offerings to enormous fears. There were stories told beside hearths of travelers who followed strange lights into the forest and never returned, of voices calling names from behind locked doors. Parents didn't tell these stories to frighten their children. They told them to remind them to respect the dark. Fear kept people alive. It was a map made of caution and ritual. The bravest weren't those who ignored it, but those who learned to listen without losing their minds. Every night began as a test. The sun would fall, and with it went the sense of safety that daylight promised. Fire was both friend and fragile savior. Entire families gathered around the hearth, eyes drawn to the flames as if it were a tiny sun holding chaos at bay. They talked softly, moved slowly, careful not to disturb whatever watched from beyond the walls. In that silence, faith became more than religion, it was warmth, light, and shield. As the wind pressed against shutters and chimneys moaned like voices, people imagined the souls of the restless dead drifting across fields. The world outside the village was a maze of uncertainty, forests too deep, ruins too old, mists too thick. Even the animals changed at night. Birds fell silent, wolves sang to the moon, and the human mind, left with nothing but flickering shadows, began to shape faces in the dark. Some believed those faces were their ancestors watching over them. Others thought they were demons reminding them of sins forgotten by daylight. To live through the night meant trusting in forces unseen. The cross hung above the bed, but so did the sprig of herbs tied with red thread. Faith blended with fragments of older traditions, echoes of pagan seasons, whispers of gods who demanded no churches, only respect. The church might have ruled the day, but the night belonged to something older, something the priests dared not name aloud. People believed because disbelief was too dangerous. Each household had its own rhythm of protection. Before sleeping, some would scatter ashes in front of the door, so that any spirit crossing would leave footprints by morning. Others spoke to the fire, asking it to remember their names. A few left windows open just a crack, believing it let the soul breathe. No one thought these acts strange. They were threads holding sanity together in a world lit only by flame and fear. You can almost hear it now, the crackling of wood, the sigh of wind under the eaves, the rhythmic drip of melted wax. Beyond that, nothing. Only the heartbeat of the world slowing with the night. People learned to listen so deeply that silence itself became language. Every sound meant something, a blessing, a warning, a promise. In this silence, imagination bloomed like a fever dream, and reality softened its edges. The line between waking and dreaming blurred. In that ancient darkness, time stretched. Hours lost meaning. Some said that night was when truth revealed itself, that what we call reality was only the day's illusion. There was a calmness in that thought, even comfort. If the dark was eternal, then so were those who faced it. And so, people began to make peace with the unseen, turning fear into ritual, ritual into rhythm. By naming their terror, they made it bearable. By acting upon it, they made it sacred. When dawn finally returned, it wasn't greeted with joy but relief. The light didn't just reveal, it forgave. Faces softened, voices rose, the world felt possible again. But everyone knew the truce would end at sunset. And so, as each day passed, preparations began anew. Wood gathered, herbs hung, prayers whispered. Life was a cycle of endurance between light and its absence. We, watching centuries later, might see superstition, but they saw survival. In their world, faith was not about belief, it was about defense. Every gesture was a shield, every whisper a fortress. They lived surrounded by mystery and found meaning within it. And perhaps, as we stare into our glowing screens, long past midnight, we still seek that same fragile comfort, the feeling that something ancient watches over us when the lights go out. In the medieval world, fear was not an idea, it was a neighbor. It had a face, a scent, and a place at the table. When crops failed or children fell ill, when the milk curdled or a shadow crossed the moon, people didn't ask times why times, they asked times who asterisk. There was always something, or someone, to blame. Evil did not live in imagination alone, it wore the same air as the living. The villagers spoke of it softly, as though naming it too loudly might draw its gaze. They believed that terror could take shape, that misfortune was only the signature of something unseen. To explain suffering, they built stories, and those stories walked among them. Demons slipped through cracked doors. Witches brewed storms in wooden bowls. The restless dead wandered crossroads, looking for warmth they no longer deserved. The night became a mirror where every unspoken fear found a reflection, and once given form, those reflections could never truly vanish. When a baby was born weak, or a harvest rotted, the villagers said a curse had been laid. If a cow refused to give milk, someone nearby must have cast the evil eye. These explanations were not madness, they were order. In a world without medicine or reason as we know it, storytelling was the science of survival. Each tale carried warning, each ritual a remedy. Fear, once given a name, could at least be spoken to, bargained with, perhaps even fooled. A woman who muttered to herself by the well became a witch by sunset. A stranger who arrived with unfamiliar herbs might be a healer or something worse. Suspicion rippled like wind through tall grass. And yet, these same fears gave birth to rituals of protection. Iron nailed above a doorway could trap a wandering spirit. Salt sprinkled on the threshold kept corruption from entering. Water blessed by a priest or anyone believed to be pure was enough to cleanse a sickness of the soul. Every gesture, every charm, was both shield and confession. Asterisk. I am afraid, but I am trying. Asterisk. In the flickering half-light of the hearth, symbols glowed like small acts of defiance. The sign of the cross scratched into wood, a rowan branch tied with red thread, a candle lit backward to confuse whatever hunted in the dark. Each act whispered the same quiet plea, let me see the morning. These protections were passed from mother to child, not as superstition but as inheritance. The body might fail, but the ritual endured. Stories of demons were especially vivid. They were said to crouch at the edges of dreams, to slip into rooms when breath grew slow. Some were shapeless fog, others grotesque parodies of the human face. The church described them as fallen angels. The people described them as everything that made the world unpredictable. Fever, plague, madness, each carried the scent of something unholy. When terror became unbearable, villagers sought the priest for blessing, but they also turned to the wise woman in the woods, the one who knew which herbs burned brightest, which stones kept voices away. Witches, too, were fear made flesh. They represented power without permission, a woman who could heal, curse, or simply live alone. To some, she was a guardian, to others, a threat. Rumors spread faster than fire. A cow's death, a failed birth, a sudden storm, all traced back to her unseen hand. At night, men told stories of secret gatherings in moonlit fields, of laughter that could twist the weather itself. These tales both condemned and comforted. They turned chaos into narrative, chance into consequence. And then there were the dead. Few believed that death ended everything. The soil could not always hold what it buried. Some graves were found disturbed, bones rearranged, hearts pierced with stakes of ash or iron. The villagers said the corpse had tried to rise, hungry for what it once knew. Such discoveries terrified them, yet confirmed what they already suspected, that death was porous, that endings were only pauses in the long conversation between worlds. In the glow of tallow candles, faces looked haunted not only by shadow but by thought. A cough in the next room might be the devil's whisper. A dream of falling could mean a curse was near. The human mind filled silence with meaning, because silence itself was unbearable. To live surrounded by mystery was to negotiate constantly with it. Fear was not merely endured, it was cultivated, shaped, and finally ritualized. Archaeologists today uncover tiny carvings of faces beneath thresholds and chimneys, charms against spirits that entered through smoke or air. They find bones of animals buried under doorsteps, dolls made of twine wrapped with human hair. These were not toys but guardians. The people who placed them there believed they were creating boundaries where none existed. Every household became a fortress built of symbols, each mark on the wall, a conversation with the unseen. When we read their records, we often smile at their simplicity. Yet, beneath those gestures lies something familiar, the need to explain what cannot be controlled, the comfort of believing that knowledge, even forbidden knowledge, might tip the balance in our favor. They did not fear darkness for its emptiness, but for its intelligence. To them, evil had intention, it listened, waited, and sometimes answered back. And so fear took on a body, because only bodies can be fought. Invisible terror was unbearable. Visible terror could be met with salt, fire, or prayer. A demon could be banished. A witch could be named. A restless soul could be buried again. Through these acts, the villagers carved patterns into chaos. They turned mystery into method, dread into duty. Still, the question lingers: what if these shapes of fear were not inventions but memories? Echoes of something older than human time, refracted through superstition and story. Perhaps the villagers did not create their demons. Perhaps they remembered them. Such thoughts stirred uneasily at the edge of sleep, where reason thins and imagination listens. By dawn, fear softened, but it never disappeared. It waited behind each sunrise, patient, certain the night would return. When the sun dipped low, the people began again, doors barred, charms renewed, prayers whispered to anyone who might be listening. In their world, safety was a performance, repeated every evening. Faith was both weapon and apology, and fear its faithful companion. As the candlelight dimmed, the villagers looked to one another and saw their own shadows dancing on the walls. They did not know whether those shadows belonged to them or to something standing just behind. Yet the night demanded acceptance. To live was to coexist with the unseen, to treat fear as both enemy and teacher. And so they did, through ritual, through story, through the trembling hope that the dark could be persuaded to show mercy. When we listen to their tales now, across centuries of light, we can still feel that echo, the heartbeat of a world where belief was survival. They didn't believe in evil, they saw it, they named it. And in naming, they gave shape to their courage as much as their terror. Inside the medieval home, protection began not with prayer, but with place. The door, the hearth, the bed, each one a frontier between the human world and everything waiting beyond. The cottage might have looked small from the outside, but to those who lived within it, it was a fortress built against the invisible. The air smelled of smoke, dried herbs, and earth. Shadows stretched across low beams carved with marks too faint for the untrained eye to notice, symbols meant to confuse, repel, or trap things that moved where light could not follow. Every corner held intention, every nail, every whisper, every herb a weapon against the unseen. The hearth was the living heart of the home. It burned through long winters, keeping both warmth and fear at bay. Fire was sacred, not just for survival, but for protection. A coal left smoldering overnight could defend a house from wandering spirits, but it had to be watched. If the flame died completely, it meant the protection had broken. Mothers taught their children never to spit in the fire, never to mock its crackle, for the flame was alive, and insults might draw its wrath. The hearth goddess of older times had been forgotten by name, yet her spirit lingered in the ritual of feeding the fire each dawn, as if renewing a covenant older than any prayer book. Above the hearth hung iron, a horseshoe, a cooking hook, sometimes an old blade dulled by time. Iron was no mere metal, it was memory of lightning, a gift wrestled from the sky. People believed that evil could not bear its presence. A woman might hammer an iron nail into the threshold after childbirth, or hide iron scissors beneath her baby's cradle to cut through any dark influence. Those scissors were never used for cloth again. They became a silent guardian, cold beneath the straw. Around the room, bunches of herbs dangled from the rafters. Rosemary, sage, and rue. Their scent mixed with smoke until the air itself felt enchanted. Each plant had its story: rosemary for remembrance, rue for warding off sickness, sage for purifying the air after quarrels or death. When someone fell ill, a handful might be tossed into the fire, sending fragrant smoke through the house as both medicine and prayer. To modern eyes it looks like superstition, yet each gesture was an act of control in a world that offered very little of it. The bed was both cradle and coffin, a place of birth, love, and sometimes last breath. Before sleep, families crossed themselves and whispered charms against nightmares. A loaf of bread might be placed near a child's head to distract wandering spirits with its scent. Some tucked small carvings of saints beneath the pillow, others whispered the names of ancestors, asking them to guard the dreamer until morning. In some regions, the bed was turned slightly away from the window so that no ghost, peering in from outside, could look directly upon the sleeper. Doorways and windows, those thin borders between inside and out, received the most attention. Crosses of chalk, herbs bound in red thread, and sigils carved into frames all served the same purpose: to remind anything entering that this house was claimed. Visitors sometimes paused at the threshold to murmur blessings or to touch iron before stepping in. Even those who claimed to believe only in the church found comfort in these habits. Faith was a layered thing: saints above, spirits below, all part of the same fragile balance. The church itself recognized the need for protection, though it dressed it in holy words. Priests sprinkled holy water in homes before winter, leaving small wax figures of the Virgin or local saints to keep watch. Families treated these figures like relatives, speaking to them softly, moving them near the fire when storms came. Beneath these pious gestures, older patterns endured. The Virgin replaced the hearth goddess, the crucifix replaced the sun charm. The rituals changed names, but not purpose. Walls were more than shelter, they were memory. Generations carved symbols into beams, circles, intersecting lines, witch marks, shaped like stars or flowers. These weren't decorations. They were traps, meant to confuse spirits or lock them in endless repetition. A spirit that couldn't find its way past a mark was doomed to chase its own shadow until dawn. In attics and cellars, modern restorers still find these carvings hidden beneath soot, silent prayers etched in wood by hands long gone. Even food carried ritual power. Bread baked with salt became a ward against envy. Milk was poured at the threshold before journeys, an offering to household spirits believed to guard both property and luck. A bowl of water left overnight might reveal omens by morning. If ripples formed without cause, something had visited. To the medieval mind, the home was not a sealed box but a breathing creature, part of the landscape, both protected by and vulnerable to unseen currents. At the edge of the room, where shadows thickened, people often placed relics, a chipped bone from a saint's shrine, a rosary, or even a pebble taken from a sacred spring. These objects bridged the gap between the divine and the domestic. Their power came not from their material, but from the stories carried within them. To touch one was to touch the invisible. Even when poverty left a family with almost nothing, they still kept a token, a fragment of lace, a blessed leaf, a memory carved into shape. Outside, the wind could howl and claw at the walls, but inside, the rituals gave rhythm to existence. Life was fragile, and every gesture was a way of asking the world to let them stay a little longer. The repetition of these acts, sprinkling, carving, hanging, whispering, wove fear into familiarity. Through them, people learned to coexist with dread rather than deny it. There was a strange peace in that coexistence, a quiet pact made nightly with the unknown. We might imagine these homes as dim and fearful, but within those walls there was also warmth. Children slept beneath charms made of feathers and ribbons, believing they would catch bad dreams. Couples held hands while reciting prayers older than their language. Every spark, every scent, every sound carried weight. The home was not only protection from the world, but proof that meaning could be built, brick by brick, against the void. And when morning finally crept through the small windows, touching walls scribbled with signs, it found not fear, but faith transformed into craft. The villagers rose to greet the light, renewed their gestures, and began the day with small thanks to the powers that had, once again, allowed them to see the dawn. In that fragile space between superstition and survival, the medieval home was both battlefield and sanctuary, a quiet testament to human ingenuity. Even now, centuries later, when we lock our doors, light candles, or hang charms we pretend are decoration, we echo their language of protection. The magic never left, it only learned to hide in plain sight. Soon, as the story widens, these private defenses will meet the larger world where whole villages join together to guard the living from the dark beyond. When darkness spread across the countryside, no house truly stood alone. The people believed that fear, like fire, could only be tamed when shared. So, they gathered around bells, around flames, around faith. A medieval village at night was a constellation of small lights scattered against an endless void, each spark trembling but refusing to die. Together, those lights formed a fragile circle of safety. When bells failed, they turned to fire. The church tower, rising over thatched roofs, was both guardian and warning. Its bell, heavy and ancient, spoke to heaven and to the fields below. When it rang at sunset, it wasn't only a call to prayer. It was a signal to draw boundaries, to pull families back from the edge of the unknown. The Angelus prayer marked the end of work and the beginning of watchfulness. In that moment, villagers felt themselves united, a single heartbeat, pulsing through the sound of metal, echoing into the dark. But the church's reach did not extend everywhere. Beyond the bell's echo lay the forests, the moors, the places where light stumbled and names meant nothing. There, older protections waited. On feast days and turning seasons, the village itself became a stage for ritual. In spring, when fields were sown and life hung in balance, people lit great fires on the hills. They called it Beltane in the older tongue, though priests gave it gentler names later. Livestock were driven between twin flames to cleanse them of misfortune. Young men leapt through the embers, shouting wishes for strength and luck. The church frowned but looked the other way. The fire kept the herds healthy and the people hopeful, and sometimes that was holier than doctrine. Midwinter brought its own gatherings, vigils of fire and song meant to hold back the longest night. Villagers built pyres from dead branches and stood in circles, faces warmed by the glow. They told stories of rebirth and returning light, blending scripture with memory of older gods. A candle might burn for the Christ child, but another flickered for the sun itself. They saw no contradiction. Faith was a tapestry woven from necessity, every thread borrowed from whoever promised survival. The church tried to claim these nights as its own. Priests led processions, sprinkling holy water on flames, once offered to the spirits of the land. Yet, under the hymns, Another rhythm lingered, the murmur of ancient words carried quietly by the elders, half remembered, half forbidden. The younger ones might not have understood, but they repeated the sounds anyway, afraid of what might happen if the old promises went unanswered. Communal protection took many shapes. When illness struck, neighbors gathered to ring the bells through the night, believing the sound could drive sickness away. In times of drought, they paraded statues of saints through the fields, chanting prayers that felt as old as the soil. Sometimes, the saints' faces were borrowed ones carved over older idols whose names no one dared speak. The church called it syncretism, but to the villagers, it was simply continuity. At weddings, the bride's procession carried torches to ward off jealous spirits. At funerals, men carried the dead around the churchyard 3 times to confuse whatever might follow. The community's movements formed invisible circles, protective loops of ritual repetition that mirrored the wheel of the seasons. Everything returned, and every return required respect. These cycles kept chaos at bay, or at least convinced the people that it could be reasoned with. There was music in these defenses. At certain festivals, the village green filled with drums and flutes, feet stomping in rhythm. Laughter became another form of spellcraft. To make noise was to declare life against the quiet of the grave. Even the drunk and the foolish played their part, for merriment itself was sacred, a spark too bright for spirits to touch. The church tolerated it, though uneasily. Too much joy, they said, might invite sin, but the villagers knew joy was not sin. It was survival disguised as celebration. On stormy nights, when lightning split the sky and thunder rolled like the end of the world, people gathered in the church not just to pray, but to listen together. The priest's voice echoed beneath stone arches as wind clawed at the doors. Children pressed close to their mothers, men stared at the trembling candles. When the storm passed, they left with renewed faith not only in God, but in each other. The shared endurance of fear was its own kind of sacrament. Outside the church walls, different fires burned. In the fields or near riverbanks, villagers sometimes held quiet vigils without the priest's blessing. They circled the flames, whispered old songs, and cast small offerings into the embers, bits of bread, drops of ale, sprigs of rosemary. These gestures were older than any sermon, remnants of a language the church tried to erase but could never fully silence. For the villagers, it wasn't rebellion, it was memory. By day, the church claimed authority over the soul. By night, the village claimed responsibility for survival. And so the two faiths, holy and hidden, coexisted, each pretending the other didn't exist. Priests condemned superstition from the pulpit, then asked the midwife for her protective charms before traveling alone. Farmers crossed themselves with one hand and threw salt with the other. In their eyes, contradiction was not hypocrisy, it was balance. The bonfire festivals became the clearest expression of this balance. As flames rose, so did voices, some singing hymns, others murmuring names never written down. Sparks climbed toward the stars, each one a prayer without words. The heat pressed against faces, turning fear into fascination. Fire connected everyone, sinner, saint, skeptic. It devoured differences, at least until morning. And when the last ember cooled, people felt lighter, as if something dark had been fed, satisfied, and sent away. For all their simplicity, these gatherings held profound power. They turned isolation into unity, helplessness into ceremony. The villagers believed that as long as they stood together, as long as they sang, burned, and remembered the night could not take them, perhaps they were right. Even now, when we light candles in dark rooms or gather around screens glowing like miniature fires, we echo their ancient circle. We are still trying to keep the dark at the edges of the light. When the church bells fell silent again, the people returned to their homes, carrying the smell of smoke and sanctity in their clothes. Children slept easier, believing the fire's warmth had followed them indoors. For a while, the world felt safe, yet beneath the ashes of every sanctioned ritual lay the memory of another older, forbidden, whispered by few. And it is there, in those quiet, secret places, between the holy and the hidden, that the story turns next to the private hands who worked charms the church dared not bless, and to the souls who wielded protection too powerful to be left unpunished. In every village, there was someone the people went to when prayers failed. A woman who knew the language of roots and rivers. A man who could read weather in the flight of crows. They were called healers, charmers, midwives, seers, until fear changed the words. Then they became witches. They cured the sick, and for that, they burned. Long before the word witch became a curse, these were the keepers of balance. They worked with what the earth offered: leaves, stones, moonlight. When a child's fever would not break, they mixed willow bark and whispered the rhythm of a charm taught by grandmothers. When a lamb was born weak, they drew circles of salt and ash around it, speaking softly as though persuading life to stay. Their hut smelled of smoke, honey, and damp soil, a fragrance both feared and sought. In a world without physicians, their hands were the only hope between pain and the grave. Yet healing was never just medicine. Every herb carried story, every gesture an invocation. To crush rosemary was to invite memory. To burn sage was to send illness away on the wind. The boundary between faith and craft blurred until no one could tell where one ended. When a cure worked, it was miracle. When it failed, it was witchcraft. The church distrusted what it could not own. It taught that healing came only from divine grace, not from hands that gathered leaves under the moon. But the villagers believed in results. They brought sick animals to the healer's door after sunset, slipping through shadows so no one would see. They paid not in coin but in bread, milk, or secrets. Gratitude whispered in fear's voice. The same mouths that praised a cure might, days later, denounce the same healer when crops failed or lightning struck. Stories spread like smoke. A wise woman in Brittany cured a fever by bathing a child in water drawn from a well said to be haunted. When the boy lived, the villagers rejoiced. But a week later, another child died, and suspicion turned. They said the spirit in the water had demanded payment. The woman was taken, questioned, and never returned. The well was sealed with stones, as if burying memory itself. Across Europe, similar tales unfolded. In the Scottish Highlands, healers carried smooth white stones believed to channel divine power. They pressed them against swollen joints, murmuring psalms rewritten as charms. In the Black Forest, cunning men used mirrors to trap illness, covering them quickly with cloth so it could not escape. In Poland, midwives placed knives under pillows during difficult births to cut invisible cords of misfortune. All were acts of compassion performed in fear's shadow. The healers never saw themselves as servants of darkness. To them, the herbs spoke plainly, the stars offered instruction, and the dead were simply ancestors who listened better than the living. Yet persecution grew like mold in damp wood. Each century sharpened suspicion until it cut flesh. Witch hunters carried books filled with rules of detection, how to spot a familiar spirit, how to recognize the devil's mark. None of them mentioned gratitude or the lives saved by these hands. Trials often began with whispers. A cow died. Butter refused to churn. A child dreamed of a black figure near the healer's hut. That was enough. The accused were dragged before judges who believed suffering revealed guilt. They were stripped, searched for signs. The devil had kissed them. The irony was cruel. The very herbs that once soothed burns were now used to prove communion with hell. Women confessed under torture, speaking names the interrogators already hoped to hear. Fear fed itself, devouring compassion first. And yet, the knowledge persisted. Some healers escaped by disguising their craft in Christian symbols. They carved crosses into their talismans, recited the Lord's Prayer backward to confuse suspicion. Others passed recipes in code: angel's breath for fennel, devil's claw for aconite language twisted to survive. Even as the pyres smoked, seeds were buried quietly, to sprout when the world softened again. It is tempting to imagine these people as defiant rebels, but most were simply tired. They wanted peace, not power. They wanted the sick to live. At night they spoke to the same God as their accusers, asking why mercy should smell of smoke. History remembers their punishment more than their purpose. But listen closely, and you can still hear the gentler rhythm beneath the flames, the sound of mortar and pestle, of water poured slowly into clay, of a whisper saying, "Asterisk, be well." Asterisk. One tale tells of an old man in a French hamlet who tended herbs by the river. He was accused of conjuring storms because his garden thrived when others failed. When the guards came, they found him crushing mint and rue for a feverish child. He looked at them and said only, "You cannot burn what heals you." They did it anyway. Afterward, the villagers avoided the river, afraid of what they'd destroyed. Within a year, the crops withered. Superstition called it curse. Perhaps it was simply absence. The tragedy of the witch healer is not merely death, but erasure. Generations of knowledge vanished into fear's fire medicines, midwifery, weather sense, lore of seasons. What survived hid in lullabies and kitchen habits. Even now, when someone ties a red thread around a wrist for luck or hangs dried herbs above a door, echoes of their wisdom stir. The line between prayer and potion was never meant to be a wall. To the villagers, every healer held contradiction. They were holy and dangerous, beloved and feared. People sought them in desperation, then shunned them in gratitude, unable to face the reminder that salvation had come from human hands. Perhaps that was the deepest sin of all, proof that comfort could be crafted without divine permission. The fires that once punished them have cooled, but their story still smolders. It asks what kind of world fears its own mercy. These were not villains in league with darkness. They were the last keepers of light in an age that could not yet explain it. The witch's tools, the herbs, the bones, the whispered charms were instruments of care forged in secrecy. Their crime was empathy, misread as power. So when we speak of witches, perhaps we should lower our voices, not out of fear but respect. The ground that holds their ashes still grows wildflowers first each spring. The earth remembers kindness even when men forget. And somewhere between myth and memory, a candle still burns on a windowsill, the healer's flame, waiting for a world that no longer needs to fear the hands that... There are places where the world forgets which way is forward, where roads meet and hesitate, unsure whether to lead the traveler home or away forever. In the medieval imagination, those places were not empty, they were thresholds. The crossroads was the pause between life and death, faith and heresy, dusk and dawn. It was said that if you whispered the right words there, something always answered back. To the villagers, crossroads were neither holy nor cursed, they were both. No one built houses nearby. Even in daylight, people crossed quickly, eyes down, pretending not to feel the weight of unseen company. At night, when fog crept low and the moon thinned to a blade, the bravest came carrying small bundles, bread, hair, salt, or the bone of a bird. These were offerings, placed quietly at the center where the paths met. No prayers were spoken, only murmured requests, a good harvest, a lost love returned, a fever lifted. The act was simple, the meaning immense. At that spot where all directions converged, the villagers hoped the worlds might touch long enough to hear them. The crossroads belonged to no one and everyone. The church had no claim there, nor did the spirits entirely. It was a place of transaction, a border market between the living and the invisible. Folk tales warned that the devil himself lingered near such crossings, listening for bargains, but few believed it literally. To most, the danger was subtler. What they feared was not damnation, but being noticed by something that did not forget. Yet the need to ask outweighed the fear of being heard. A farmer might bury a coin there before planting season, believing the soil would remember his generosity. A widow might pour milk at midnight to appease the soul of her husband, buried far from consecrated ground. Travelers left pebbles or breadcrumbs to ensure safe passage. Over centuries, these gestures accumulated small layers of gratitude, guilt, and longing pressed into the earth, until the ground itself became heavy with memory. Sometimes the ritual required voice. Those who sought answers came alone, standing at the crossroads just before dawn, when the air was neither night nor morning. They whispered questions to the wind about lost children, stolen cattle, unspoken sins. The rule was never to turn around. Whatever approached from behind, whether wind, footsteps, or whisper, was not to be acknowledged. The answers, if they came, arrived as dreams later, or as coincidences that felt too precise to dismiss. Anthropologists, centuries later, called these places liminal zones, thresholds, where categories dissolve. But to those who walked the dirt paths by moonlight, it was simpler. This was where the world listened. They understood instinctively what modern minds struggle to accept, that boundaries are porous, and silence has weight. The church feared these practices because they were ungoverned. A peasant who prayed at a crossroads needed no priest, no permission. Authority faltered in the face of mystery. Sermons warned that such gatherings invited the devil, yet confessions revealed something gentler. People sought comfort, not chaos. One record tells of a woman who buried a lock of her dead child's hair at a crossroads, whispering, "Let her find her way." For that, she was made to repent before the entire village. But perhaps the child slept easier for it. There were darker versions too. Stories whispered of those who made vows there, promises bound by shadow. A musician who left his instrument at the crossing, returning at dawn to find it tuned by unseen hands. A farmer who buried a black feather, asking for strength, only to dream of wings and storms for the rest of his life. Such tales were not warnings as much as acknowledgments. Power never comes without attention from whatever gives it. Some believed the crossroads trapped wandering souls. When criminals or suicides were denied church burial, their bodies were placed there, pinned beneath stones. The reasoning was both practical and mystical. The four roads confused the spirit, forcing it to wander endlessly, unable to return home or haunt the living. The place of punishment became, paradoxically, a sanctuary of containment. Over time, people left offerings not for the dead themselves, but for peace, a kind of apology to those trapped at the edge of belonging. At certain seasons, entire communities met at crossroads under the pretense of cleaning or repairing the paths. They brought food and torches, turning maintenance into ritual. Old songs were sung softly, almost as if by accident. Each voice folded into the next until the air hummed with memory. These gatherings balanced the visible and the invisible, acknowledging what could not be seen while pretending not to. The church often blessed the event afterward, naming it a purification. But the people knew the truth. It was negotiation. In some regions, black dogs were said to guard the crossroads, spectral and patient. Travelers claimed to see their eyes glinting in moonlight, reflections of souls caught between worlds. To meet one and show respect to bow, a whispered greeting was to ensure safe passage. To mock or strike it was to invite misfortune. These stories taught courtesy to the unknown, a quiet reminder that arrogance was the only true sin in the presence of mystery. If you stood there long enough, you could feel the weight of generations pressing through the soil. Footsteps upon footsteps, wishes upon wishes, the residue of centuries of hope and fear. Some claimed to hear faint voices when the wind turned a certain way, not words, but tones, like a choir too distant to be understood. Others felt only stillness, as if time itself paused to listen. That pause, that breath of suspension, was the essence of the crossroads. We like to think of superstition as a failure of reason, but at the crossroads, it was reason that faltered first. The mind, faced with too much uncertainty, sought pattern in the dirt. It built meaning from dust because meaning was survival. To whisper at the intersection of paths was not an act of delusion, it was a way of remembering that existence itself depends on unseen crossings, of breath and silence, of birth and death, of light and shadow. Even now, these old beliefs echo. Travelers toss coins at highway junctions. Lovers carve initials into signposts. Mourners leave flowers at roadside shrines. The symbols have changed, but the impulse remains. To acknowledge that somewhere between one road and another, the world listens. When the villagers finished their offerings, they left the crossroads walking backward, careful not to turn their faces toward what lingered there. To look again was to invite it home. They returned to their cottages, hands cold, hearts strangely lighter, as though they'd shared their burdens with the night itself. The next morning, the bread and coins would be gone, perhaps taken by animals, perhaps by wind, but no one checked too closely. The important thing was that the offering had been accepted, and for a while, balance restored. The crossroads waited patiently for the next soul brave or desperate enough to speak into its silence. And from there, as faith and fear continued to entwine, the church began to listen too, not to understand, but to control. What it could not bless, it would learn. For centuries, faith did not live in churches alone. It lived in kitchens, in fields, and in the quiet corners of rooms where candles flickered beside bowls of water that no priest had blessed. People did not draw hard lines between holy and haunted. To them, the world was layered, heaven above, hell below, and something far older humming between. When holy water ran out, they made their own. The church tried to order the chaos of belief, to draw borders around mystery. But in the medieval countryside, borders meant little. The priest might thunder about salvation from the pulpit, yet his parishioners still buried iron beneath doorways and whispered charms while crossing themselves. To them, these acts were not contradictions. They were insurance prayers of different dialects addressed to the same invisible world. Many priests understood this quiet blending and let it be. In small parishes where life hung by thin threads of harvest and health, tolerance was survival. A village could not afford to anger the unseen, no matter what the bishop decreed. So, on certain nights, the priest would sprinkle his holy water over fields already circled with ash and salt. He might scold his flock in daylight for superstition, but at dusk, he too watched the horizon, muttering protection under his breath. The coexistence was delicate. Saints became new faces for old gods. Saint Bridget of Kildare, patroness of hearth and poetry, wore the garments of an ancient goddess who once guarded the same flames. In France, villagers invoked Saint Nicholas to protect livestock, a task once entrusted to the horned spirits of pasture and wood. Across the Alps, Saint Leonard absorbed the powers of a pagan guardian of prisoners and beasts. The church canonized the land's memories rather than erased them. The names changed, the rituals endured. Beneath the stone and incense, faith remained a patchwork. Holy water mingled with well water drawn from sacred springs. Pilgrims carried soil from ancient barrows, believing it blessed by saints, though those mounds had been holy long before Christ walked the earth. Icons hung beside talismans of bone and bronze. A prayer to Saint Michael might end with a whisper to something unnamed, something that had guarded the family since before baptismal fonts replaced sacred groves. The church's hierarchy saw danger in this blending. Faith diluted by folklore threatened its claim to absolute truth. So inquisitors were sent, men with ink-stained hands and minds trained in Latin, walking through villages where no one could read. They found altars covered in both rosaries and feathers, relics mixed with herbs. They saw crosses carved beside runes, and to them, it looked like rebellion. But it wasn't rebellion. It was remembrance. Inquisition records, written with fury and fear, tell of peasants who prayed to devils disguised as saints. Yet if we listen beyond the accusations, another voice speaks, one of longing. These people wanted protection, not heresy. When they knelt before a statue, they weren't concerned with its theological correctness. They cared only that it listened. The church gave names and rules, the people gave stories and trust. Between them lay centuries of negotiation. In some parishes, compromise became custom. Villagers carried images of saints through fields in spring, as priests chanted Latin blessings. But after dark, they left offerings of milk and honey by the hedgerows for the good neighbors, the fair folk who still owned the night. It was not disobedience but diplomacy. Every unseen power, divine or otherwise, had to be acknowledged, or the balance would break. Priests who grew up among their flocks understood the rhythm. One English vicar, writing in the 15th century, admitted privately that charms worked because the people believe in them so earnestly that heaven must listen. He kept a bundle of herbs under his bed, for the air, he claimed. Another confessed that when storms came, he rang the church bell not to frighten demons but to steady his own heart. Others were less forgiving. In towns where the church's grip was tighter, these small syncretisms became grounds for punishment. A woman caught lighting candles for Saint Anne and muttering an unfamiliar chant was accused of idolatry. A farmer who buried bread in a field after blessing it with holy water was charged with sacrilege. Fear hardened faith into law. The inquisitors could not tolerate a world where mystery belonged to everyone. It had to belong to them. Yet the people's faith slipped through fingers of authority like smoke. Stories transformed saints into companions. not icons. Saint Christopher, towering and kind, became a wanderer who could cross rivers of souls. Saint Margaret, said to have defeated a dragon, protected women in childbirth long after her tale was banned from sermons. Each legend carried traces of older myths: the dragon, a remnant of chaos; the water crossing, a memory of ancient passage rites. The people didn't mind the mix. Their faith was not a wall but a river. Even church architecture absorbed older patterns. Builders placed cathedrals on sites of pagan worship, believing the new holiness would tame the old. But sometimes, the old seeped upward instead. Gargoyles leered from rooftops, half beast, half angel, reminders that light cannot exist without shadow. Inside, saint statues bore expressions too wild for doctrine, as though the stones still remembered other prayers once spoken there. What emerged was a strange harmony, a faith both sanctioned and secret. Villagers prayed in Latin they didn't understand, yet at home they spoke to the fire as if it were alive. They celebrated holy days that aligned suspiciously well with solstices and equinoxes. When told to kneel before the altar, they did, but afterward they tied ribbons to the old oak behind the churchyard, where the wind could carry their wishes farther than any sermon ever would. It's easy, centuries later, to see contradiction, but to them it was wholeness. Life was too fragile to gamble on only one kind of prayer. If heaven failed, the earth might still listen. If saints were slow to answer, the river might whisper back. The human spirit, caught between command and chaos, built bridges wherever it could. The church never truly conquered the countryside. It learned to live atop it. Every bell that rang over a village carried two meanings, one for the priests, one for the people. One called them to worship. The other, quieter and older, reminded them that faith, like fire, spreads only when shared, and that truth, once buried, always finds a way to rise. And so, beneath the weight of doctrine, a hidden religion thrived, one that bowed to saints by day and spoke to spirits by night. Its hymns echoed between the pews and the woods, between the blessed and the forbidden. For every holy relic displayed on the altar, another lay buried beneath the floorboards, wrapped in cloth, humming softly through the centuries. Soon, the inquisitors would learn that words could not contain belief, and neither could walls. For those who sought to trace the roots of faith would find them buried deep in ink, in symbol, in manuscripts too dangerous to read aloud. Ink was their last safe place. When voices could be silenced and bodies burned, words still found ways to hide. In the dim candlelight of monasteries, cottages, and secret workshops, people wrote. Not always with permission, rarely with safety, but always with purpose. They scratched symbols into parchment and vellum, layered meaning beneath prayer, and stitched memory between the lines of scripture. Every stroke of ink was an act of survival belief preserved through the language of shadow. The medieval world worshipped the written word, yet feared it too. To read was to hold power, to write even more so. The church guarded literacy like a sacred flame, placing pens only in the hands of monks and scholars sworn to obedience. But outside the cloister walls, others wrote quietly, dangerously. Wise women copied recipes for healing and protection in cramped margins of psalters. Traveling scribes traded verses of astrology disguised as hymns. Even merchants, taught to tally numbers, learned to code invocations into their ledgers. Every text had two lives, one for the eye, one for the soul. Among the pages of official devotion, we still find traces of these hidden ones. In the margins of illuminated Bibles, a faint line of ink curves into a charm for good harvest. Beneath a painted saint, a scribe added a sigil so small it could be mistaken for decoration, a loop of protection meant to ward off the very forces the saint was said to control. These secret marks turned the page into a battlefield where doctrine and desperation met. The church copied truth, the people added hope. Some grimoires, books of magic, prayer, and science all at once survived in fragments. They were never bound in gold or kept on altars. They were tucked into walls, sealed in jars, or buried beside those who feared their discovery. When unearthed centuries later, their ink still glimmered faintly, as though refusing to die. Scholars call them superstition, but to the ones who wrote them, they were manuals for endurance. Consider Times, the Book of Saint Cyprian *, a legendary text said to blend Christian invocation with sorcery. In its pages, demons and angels are summoned side by side, each compelled by Latin prayers rewritten as commands. Its authorship remains unknown, perhaps a monk disillusioned by obedience, perhaps a healer desperate for legitimacy. The book traveled through whispers and copies, changing shape with each century, absorbing local customs like a living thing. To possess it was to hold both salvation and danger. In a crumbling manuscript from the Baltic coast, scholars found pages filled with charms against storms. The handwriting wavers, as though written by someone afraid or hurried. Between invocations of the Virgin Mary appear older names, forgotten deities of wind and sea. One margin reads, **, blessed be she who listens to both sides. **. The words are not theology, they are confession. Not all the hidden writing belonged to magicians. Ordinary believers filled their prayer books with private editions, notes for dreams, cures, or fears too personal for sermons. Some left small drawings, circles enclosing crosses, flowers sprouting from skulls. To modern eyes they seem decorative. To their makers, these sketches held intention. The act of writing was itself ritual, each letter a protection, each word a wall against oblivion. Monks, too, were not immune to temptation. Bored or burdened by silence, some inked small rebellions into sacred texts. In one manuscript from the 13th century, a monk added beside a psalm, **, Lord, forgive me, for this ink carries more than prayer. **. Beneath that, barely visible, lies an astrological chart drawn in faded red. Even within the church, belief spilled beyond permission. Literacy was a door no authority could fully close. Inquisitors understood this power and feared it. During witch trials, written charms were treated as proof of guilt. A slip of paper with strange symbols could condemn an entire household. Writing became evidence of heresy, yet those accused rarely destroyed their papers. Some hid them beneath floorboards, others clutched them even as the flames rose, trusting the ink to outlive flesh. Many did. Centuries later, archivists uncovered these scorched fragments, edges blackened, but words still legible, a testament that belief, once written, resists erasure. There was a strange irony. The church itself preserved much of what it tried to destroy. Confiscated manuscripts were stored as curiosities or warnings, later forgotten in vaults. When rediscovered, they spoke with voices the world thought lost. In dusty libraries across Europe, pages bound in animal skin still whisper secrets into the silence. The letters shimmer faintly where light touches them, remnants of faith transformed into artifact. What these manuscripts reveal is not rebellion, but yearning. The writers were not always witches or heretics. Many were simply people trying to reconcile wonder with rule. Their texts read like negotiations. If I pray thus, will it still be sin? If I bless this herb, will it count as faith? The answers never came, so they kept writing. Ink became prayer in its purest form, private, patient, eternal. Each page carries more than words. Smudges mark the trembling of hands. Candle wax dots the parchment where someone leaned too close, afraid to lose a line. Some pages are torn where names were scratched out, perhaps to protect the living. Others bear fingerprints in the margins, ghosts of those who turned them, who believed the act of reading could summon safety. The manuscripts do not just preserve knowledge, they preserve touch. When we read them now, across centuries, we enter an intimacy the authors never intended. Their secrecy invites us in quietly. Like trespassers in a sacred ruin, we hear the hush of quills, the scrape of thought against silence. Between the lines lies something universal, the desire to be remembered, to leave a trace too small for fire to find. These hidden texts also changed history's rhythm. Because of them, knowledge once forbidden survived long enough to evolve into science, medicine, and art. The alchemist's formulas, the healer's herb lists, the astronomer's diagrams, all descendants of those who dared to write without permission. They gave future generations the courage to ask questions again, to risk the wrath of certainty. And so, the manuscripts of the hidden ones still breathe. Each rediscovered fragment feels like a heartbeat from another world. Ink may fade, but its pulse continues. Every time a scholar or dreamer turns a fragile page, the circle completes the living and the dead sharing a secret once more. We end this chapter where many of those writers began, in awe. The candlelight flickers over their words, illuminating not rebellion but persistence. These were people who believed that truth could live between letters, that silence could be spoken, that salvation might yet be written by hand. Soon, the story will leave parchment behind and turn to flesh, to the ways belief inscribed itself upon the body and mind, making every heartbeat, every dream, a text of its own. They wore their prayers on skin. Before faith was spoken in cathedrals or written in books, it was carved, burned, or bound into the body itself. The flesh was the first altar, and it carried every hope, every plea, every secret. In an age when disease, famine, and war could erase a life without warning, the body became the only canvas that would not be lost. And so, people marked themselves not from vanity or violence, but from belief. Each mark was a message to the unseen. Asterisk, I am here, I am protected. Asterisk. In some regions, small crosses were scratched into the arms of children soon after birth. The cuts were shallow, washed with wine or salt, and believed to confuse evil spirits searching for unmarked souls. In the northern villages, women pricked their palms with needles dipped in ash, tracing patterns shaped like stars or spirals. These tiny sigils faded with time, but left faint shadows, scars that became part of family inheritance, invisible ink passed from one generation to the next. The pain was brief, the meaning eternal. To understand these rituals, we must remember that the medieval world was not ruled by science, but by symbol. Skin was more than boundary. It was barrier and bridge. To pierce it was to speak directly to the divine. Blood was the language everyone understood, the proof of life and the price of safety. When danger came, plague, sickness, childbirth, people sought to mark themselves anew, to renew the contract between flesh and faith. A small cut could feel like an act of control, a way of saying, "You cannot take me without my permission." Amulets, too, carried this intimate power. They were fragments of protection, often worn so close they left their shape impressed upon the skin. In England, peasants tied bits of iron to their belts or hid them in pockets. Iron, born of fire and stone, was thought to frighten spirits forged of colder elements. In the Baltic lands, bones of small animals were polished into pendants, each one engraved with a symbol no priest could read. To outsiders, these trinkets seemed primitive. To those who wore them, they were personal armor. The line between ornament and invocation did not exist. The wealthier classes were not exempt from such talismans. Noble women wore reliquaries around their necks, tiny silver cases, holding fragments of saints, pressed flowers, or curls of a child's hair. Some kept scraps of parchment, inscribed with psalms folded against their hearts. The church tolerated these, for the boundary between relic and amulet was uncomfortably thin. A relic was holy if sanctioned, superstition if secret. Most people chose not to ask which was which. In southern Italy, sailors wore coral, carved into horns or twisted shapes to deflect the evil eye. In the east, traders carried small discs of hammered bronze inscribed with both Christian crosses and pagan runes, unsure which might work faster. In rural France, women hung teeth of wolves above the cradle to give infants courage. Each object was a fragment of a forgotten theology, faith reduced to touch. To feel the charm against one's skin was to feel less alone in the great uncertainty of existence. There were more somber practices too. During outbreaks of plague, villagers cut small marks into their wrists or forearms in the shape of the cross, letting a few drops of blood fall to the ground. They believed the earth would recognize the offering and spare them. It rarely did, but the act itself offered solace. Pain became prayer. In a world where the church spoke in distant Latin, the body spoke in blood, immediate, undeniable, honest. Some markings were invisible to the eye. Charms whispered over the body, breaths held through the last words of a prayer, gestures traced in the air, that left no scar but lingered in memory. The sign of the cross, repeated countless times a day, was a motion older than the faith that claimed it. To touch forehead, chest, shoulders, it was a map of the self, a reminder that protection begins within. There were those who believed the skin held gateways. They tattooed small dots along veins or near joints, points of spiritual defense. These marks, made with soot or plant dye, resembled constellations scattered across the body. Some patterns mirrored the night sky of certain holy days, aligning flesh with cosmos. Scholars dismissed them as superstition. Modern historians see them as the earliest expressions of identity and resistance. A body marked by choice, even in fear, declared ownership of its own fate. Amulets often changed with the seasons. In spring, herbs were sewn into small pouches, vervain for luck, rue for health, thyme for courage, and tied around the neck. By winter, they were replaced with bits of wax, blessed at Candlemas, melted from the same candles that had guarded the church from storms. The cycle was endless. Herbs to wax, wax to ash, ash to soil, soil to seed. The people trusted that as long as they participated in this rhythm, the world would recognize them as part of its design. The church's opinion on such practices shifted with convenience. Some priests condemned them outright as pagan, insisting that faith belonged to soul, not skin. Others quietly blessed the charms, understanding that belief must live where fear does in the body. A few even wore their own amulets, hidden beneath robes, a scrap of parchment inscribed with a verse, a relic wrapped in silk, a sliver of bone worn smooth by thumb and prayer. Piety and pragmatism shared the same pocket. When archaeologists unearth these objects today, they find intimacy preserved in dust, a pendant shaped by hand, the thumbprint still faint on its surface, a pouch of herbs turned to powder, a ring of iron worn thin by years of touch. Each artifact tells the same story, that faith once had weight, that salvation could be held, warmed, or hidden. And what of the scars? They, too, speak. A cut on a palm, a faded circle near the wrist, a burn in the shape of a cross, all remnants of dialogue between body and fear. We often imagine medieval faith as submission, but these marks reveal something more defiant, a human insistence on participation. People did not wait for divine protection. They made it with their own flesh. The modern eye might see these acts as crude, but to those who performed them, they were grace made visible. The skin carried what the tongue could not say. Every line, every bruise, every amulet pressed against a beating heart was evidence that belief was not only something to think, it was something to wear, to bleed, to renew. In the flicker of the candle, these bodies must have gleamed like scriptures written in living ink, each scar a verse, each charm a punctuation of hope. Their rituals did not deny suffering, they gave it meaning. Protection was never guaranteed, but participation was, and sometimes, that was enough. As generations passed, the markings faded, the bones returned to soil, the amulets rusted, yet something of them remains in us. In tattoos that tell stories, in lockets worn close to the heart, in the instinct to touch wood, to kiss a charm before a journey. The body still remembers what it once knew, that to survive is to believe through the skin. Soon, this story will move from the outer shell inward, from marks and metals to the invisible rituals of the mind, where belief itself becomes its own kind of shield. To dream was to fight darkness with imagination. When the body could no longer keep watch, the mind took up its own lantern and wandered through the night. In the medieval world, sleep was not surrender, it was a journey, one as dangerous and revealing as life itself. Dreams were not dismissed as fantasies. They were messages, maps, warnings, and sometimes weapons. People believed the soul traveled while the body rested. Sleep loosened the spirit from its earthly weight, letting it roam through realms unseen by waking eyes. For some, this was liberation, for others, peril. The church taught that dreams could be snares of the devil, temptations painted in illusion. But villagers knew better. Not every dream came from darkness. Some were gifts, delivered softly by ancestors or angels disguised as ordinary faces. The difference, they said, was how one felt upon waking. The heart knew which realm had spoken. The night was thick with unseen movement. Candles burned low, leaving shadows that seemed to breathe. People learned to protect the sleeper as they would protect the living. Before lying down, they crossed themselves and whispered a prayer to the guardian saint of dreams, Saint Raphael for guidance, Saint Michael for safety. Mothers hung charms above cradles, small circles of woven straw or bits of iron shaped like moons. A baby's first nightmare was not dismissed. It was a sign that the child's spirit had begun to learn the paths of both fear and hope. Many believed the soul could be stolen in sleep. Stories told of witches who crept through keyholes as mist, sitting upon a dreamer's chest to drain their breath. These night hags, as the church later called them, were the personification of something older, what we now might call paralysis or terror. A moment when the body could not move though the mind still struggled to wake. The villagers did not have the language of science, but they had imagination. They saw the weight on the chest, the shadow in the corner, the whisper that called their name, and they gave it form so that it could be fought. To defend themselves, they turned to ritual: salt at the windows, an open Bible near the bed, iron scissors beneath the pillow, small axe to guard the boundary between sleep and waking. A cup of water left beside the bed would catch stray spirits before they could reach the dreamer. If someone woke screaming, the family did not shake them immediately. They whispered the dream back into silence, allowing it to leave the room without offense. The night demanded courtesy as much as courage. For those who sought to understand, dream interpretation became its own kind of science. Scholars and mystics wrote manuals explaining symbols. A bridge meant transition, water meant spirit, a broken mirror foretold sorrow. But outside the monasteries, the villagers made their own dictionaries of meaning. A dream of birds could signal the coming of guests. A dream of teeth falling out might predict news from afar. Each community built its own mythology of sleep, blending scripture with superstition. The important thing was not whether the dream was true, but whether it could be used. Some dreams became communal prophecy. In one village, a shepherd claimed to see in his sleep a great storm that would flood the valley. The priest dismissed it, but the people listened. They moved their herds to higher ground, and when the river swelled weeks later, they survived. After that, no one doubted the power of dreams. For generations, the villagers gathered each winter to share their night visions, believing that together they could foresee the year's fortune. The church called it blasphemy. The villagers called it prudence. Yet dreams were not always warnings. They could heal, too. When grief grew unbearable, the lost often returned in sleep, their faces calm, their voices soft. The dead visit only when they are remembered, said an old saying, and so the bereaved went to bed with open hearts, hoping for reunion. A dream was a conversation that needed no words, a moment when love escaped death's grip, if only until morning. In monasteries, monks recorded their dreams in secret journals. Some believed that divine wisdom spoke more clearly through visions than through study. One monk wrote of a dream where Christ appeared not as king, but as a humble peasant carrying water. Another described a blackbird perched upon the altar, refusing to fly until the candles were relit. Whether symbolic or supernatural, these visions shaped their faith more deeply than any sermon. The church tolerated such accounts when they confirmed doctrine, and quietly burned them when they didn't. Dreams also bridged faiths. In the Islamic world, scholars studied dreams as revelations from God, and their writings filtered north into Europe through trade and conquest. The idea that the subconscious could reflect divine order fascinated even skeptical minds. To dream was to participate in creation itself, a nightly rehearsal of birth, death, and resurrection. In a way, the dreamer became both pilgrim and prophet, walking landscapes built from their own soul. Sometimes those landscapes blurred into waking life. There were stories of people who saw omens in their dreams and followed them by day, discovering lost objects, healing herbs, or hidden springs. These dream-led discoveries gave rise to the belief that sleep was a form of guidance. If prayer spoke upward, dreaming spoke inward. Together, they formed a circle of protection, one for the body, one for the spirit. To the modern ear, these tales sound poetic, but beneath them lies something profoundly human. In their fear of night terrors and their faith in visions, Medieval dreamers were exploring the same truth psychologists would name centuries later, that the mind protects itself through story. The images that visited them, angels, demons, lovers, monsters, were mirrors of their own endurance. Their dreams gave chaos a language and dread a shape. To awaken was to return from battle, sometimes victorious, sometimes not, but always changed. The dream world also offered quiet rebellion. In dreams, peasants could speak with kings, sinners could meet saints, women could fly, and the poor could feast. It was the one realm where hierarchy dissolved. No one could police the imagination. Perhaps that is why dreams frightened the powerful, because they reminded even the humblest soul of its inner infinity. As dawn crept through the shutters, the dream world retreated, but never completely. Morning prayers carried traces of its imagery, shaping how the day unfolded. If the night had been peaceful, people worked with calm certainty. If restless, they stepped lightly, wary of what lingered unseen. The dream, though vanished, remained a ghost of feeling. And so, through dreams, the medieval soul found a form of defense that required no weapon, no charm, only surrender to the inner dark. Every night became a rehearsal for survival. Every dream a small negotiation with mystery. When sleep reclaimed them, they entered willingly, lanterns dimmed, but hearts awake, trusting that the world within would guard them from the world without. Soon, our story will follow those dreams outward, into the waking landscape, into forests, stones, and rivers that carried the same invisible presence, the same murmured promise that faith, in every form, finds a way to endure. To dream was to fight darkness with imagination. When the body could no longer keep watch, the mind took up its own lantern and wandered through the night. In the medieval world, sleep was not surrender. It was a journey, one as dangerous and revealing as life itself. Dreams were not dismissed as fantasies. They were messages, maps, warnings, and sometimes weapons. People believed the soul traveled while the body rested. Sleep loosened the spirit from its earthly weight, letting it roam through realms unseen by waking eyes. For some, this was liberation. For others, peril. The church taught that dreams could be snares of the devil, temptations painted in illusion. But villagers knew better. Not every dream came from darkness. Some were gifts, delivered softly by ancestors or angels disguised as ordinary faces. The difference, they said, was how one felt upon waking. The heart knew which realm had spoken. The night was thick with unseen movement. Candles burned low, leaving shadows that seemed to breathe. People learned to protect the sleeper as they would protect the living. Before lying down, they crossed themselves and whispered a prayer to the guardian saint of dreams, Saint Raphael for guidance, Saint Michael for safety. Mothers hung charms above cradles, small circles of woven straw or bits of iron shaped like moons. A baby's first nightmare was not dismissed. It was a sign that the child's spirit had begun to learn the paths of both fear and hope. Many believed the soul could be stolen in sleep. Stories told of witches who crept through keyholes as mist, sitting upon a dreamer's chest to drain their breath. These night hags, as the church later called them, were the personification of something older, what we now might call paralysis or terror. A moment when the body could not move though the mind still struggled to wake. The villagers did not have the language of science, but they had imagination. They saw the weight on the chest, the shadow in the corner, the whisper that called their name, and they gave it form so that it could be fought. To defend themselves, they turned to ritual, salt at the windows, an open Bible near the bed, iron scissors beneath the pillow, small axe to guard the boundary between sleep and waking. A cup of water left beside the bed would catch stray spirits before they could reach the dreamer. If someone woke screaming, the family did not shake them immediately. They whispered the dream back into silence, allowing it to leave the room without offense. The night demanded courtesy as much as courage. For those who sought to understand, dream interpretation became its own kind of science. Scholars and mystics wrote manuals explaining symbols. A bridge meant transition, water meant spirit, a broken mirror foretold sorrow. But outside the monasteries, the villagers made their own dictionaries of meaning. A dream of birds could signal the coming of guests. A dream of teeth falling out might predict news from afar. Each community built its own mythology of sleep, blending scripture with superstition. The important thing was not whether the dream was true, but whether it could be used. Some dreams became communal prophecy. In one village, a shepherd claimed to see in his sleep a great storm that would flood the valley. The priest dismissed it, but the people listened. They moved their herds to higher ground, and when the river swelled weeks later, they survived. After that, no one doubted the power of dreams. For generations, the villagers gathered each winter to share their night visions, believing that together they could foresee the year's fortune. The church called it blasphemy. The villagers called it prudence. Yet dreams were not always warnings. They could heal, too. When grief grew unbearable, the lost often returned in sleep, their faces calm, their voices soft. The dead visit only when they are remembered, said an old saying, and so the bereaved went to bed with open hearts, hoping for reunion. A dream was a conversation that needed no words, a moment when love escaped death's grip, if only until morning. In monasteries, monks recorded their dreams in secret journals. Some believed that divine wisdom spoke more clearly through visions than through study. One monk wrote of a dream where Christ appeared not as king, but as a humble peasant carrying water. Another described a blackbird perched upon the altar, refusing to fly until the candles were relit. Whether symbolic or supernatural, these visions shaped their faith more deeply than any sermon. The church tolerated such accounts when they confirmed doctrine, and quietly burned them when they didn't. Dreams also bridged faiths. In the Islamic world, scholars studied dreams as revelations from God, and their writings filtered north into Europe through trade and conquest. The idea that the subconscious could reflect divine order fascinated even skeptical minds. To dream was to participate in creation itself, a nightly rehearsal of birth, death, and resurrection. In a way, the dreamer became both pilgrim and prophet, walking landscapes built from their own soul. Sometimes those landscapes blurred into waking life. There were stories of people who saw omens in their dreams and followed them by day, discovering lost objects, healing herbs, or hidden springs. These dream-led discoveries gave rise to the belief that sleep was a form of guidance. If prayer spoke upward, dreaming spoke inward. Together, they formed a circle of protection, one for the body, one for the spirit. To the modern ear, these tales sound poetic, but beneath them lies something profoundly human. In their fear of night terrors and their faith in visions, medieval dreamers were exploring the same truth psychologists would name centuries later, that the mind protects itself through story. The images that visited them, angels, demons, lovers, monsters, were mirrors of their own endurance. Their dreams gave chaos a language and dread a shape. To awaken was to return from battle, sometimes victorious, sometimes not, but always changed. The dream world also offered quiet rebellion. In dreams, peasants could speak with kings, sinners could meet saints, women could fly, and the poor could feast. It was the one realm where hierarchy dissolved. No one could police the imagination. Perhaps that is why dreams frightened the powerful, because they reminded even the humblest soul of its inner infinity. As dawn crept through the shutters, the dream world retreated, but never completely. Morning prayers carried traces of its imagery, shaping how the day unfolded. If the night had been peaceful, people worked with calm certainty. If restless, they stepped lightly, wary of what lingered unseen. The dream, though vanished, remained a ghost of feeling. And so, through dreams, the medieval soul found a form of defense that required no weapon, no charm, only surrender to the inner dark. Every night became a rehearsal for survival. Every dream a small negotiation with mystery. When sleep reclaimed them, they entered willingly, lanterns dimmed, but hearts awake, trusting that the world within would guard them from the world without. Soon, our story will follow those dreams outward, into the waking landscape, into forests, stones, and rivers that carried the same invisible presence, the same murmured promise that faith, in every form, finds a way to endure. They feared the dead would remember the living. For the medieval mind, death was not an ending, but a pause, a threshold like all others, uncertain and unstable. The earth received the body, yet something of the person lingered, hovering between silence and memory. In a world where faith promised resurrection but fear whispered otherwise, people learned to treat the dead not only with reverence, but with caution. Burial was never merely disposal, it was negotiation. The living had to persuade the dead to stay asleep. Every grave was a contract, sealed with ritual and hope. A body unburied, or buried wrongly, was a danger, not just a moral one, but a physical threat. The villagers had seen enough to believe it. After all, the soil sometimes refused to hold what it was given. Archaeologists uncover evidence of this uneasy relationship: graves with stones placed in mouths, bodies pinned by iron spikes or weighted by bricks. To modern eyes, these seem brutal. To those who performed them, they were acts of mercy. A stone in the mouth silenced hunger. Iron held the soul in place. The dead, they believed, could forget their station, could rise again in confusion or longing, seeking warmth they no longer owned. The living loved their dead too much to risk meeting them again. Cemeteries were liminal places, boundaries between village and wilderness. They were arranged not by chance but by fear's geometry: graves facing east, toward the light, so that on Judgment Day, the bodies could rise in the right direction. But not all were given that privilege. Those who died by suicide, by crime, or outside the church's grace, were buried at crossroads or in unmarked fields. Their souls were considered restless, condemned to wander. Still, even these burials carried care. A handful of earth from holy ground might be placed over the heart. A wooden cross might be left, though unblessed. The line between compassion and protection was as thin as the veil between worlds. Night burials were avoided when possible. Yet sometimes the need for secrecy demanded them: when plague spread, when heresy tainted the name, when fear outweighed grief. By torchlight, shadows bent long across open pits. The air smelled of wax and wet soil. Those who dug said the earth sounded different at night, hollow and watchful. After covering the grave, they would whisper apologies into the ground, asking the dead to understand the haste. Churchyards grew crowded. Bones shifted beneath the surface as years passed, pressing upward, reminding the living that death was never far below. To manage this, older remains were moved to ossuaries, chambers of orderly bones, stacked like archives of mortality. Within those walls, the skulls seemed to watch. The faithful entered to pray, others entered simply to remember. The presence of so much death was meant to humble, but it also comforted. Death, gathered and named, became less fearsome. Still, stories persisted of graves that failed to stay closed. In remote villages, people whispered of the times, Naxera, times the corpse that consumed itself, chewing on its burial shroud, spreading sickness through the family it left behind. To stop it, they placed stones in the mouth or tied the jaw shut. Others told of the times Upir*, the drinker of life, who walked home after burial, knocking on doors it once knew. These tales were not indulgences in horror. They were explanations for grief that struck twice. When someone sickened after a funeral, when livestock died without cause, it felt natural to suspect that love itself had turned predatory. Excavations in Eastern Europe reveal skeletons pinned with sickles, throats severed posthumously, grim but methodical. Each measure followed a rule, a ritual logic: bind the spirit, release the village. Beneath the violence lay a tenderness born of desperation. They did not hate the dead, they feared their longing. To cut, to weigh, to bind, these were ways of saying time's rest. Graveside offerings tell another story: coins on eyes, herbs in hands, shoes at the feet. The coins were for passage, the herbs for peace, the shoes for journeys beyond. These gestures carried centuries of inherited hope, drawn from pagan, Christian, and personal sources alike. The people trusted that care shown in burial would echo beyond it. If the body was honored, the soul would not resent the living. Some believed the dead lingered not from malice but from love. When candles flickered or doors creaked, it was said to be a visitation, a reminder that affection could not decay. The church warned against such comfort, insisting that spirits seen were demons in disguise. Yet even priests hesitated to dismiss what they themselves sometimes felt: the sudden chill in a chapel, the whisper of a name during prayer. The living and the dead shared too much silence to ever be truly separate. To guard against confusion, burial rituals became intricate choreography. Bells tolled to announce the passing and to scare away the curious unseen. Holy water was sprinkled in patterns that mirrored stars, marking a celestial return. Candles burned for days to guide the spirit, their smoke carrying prayers skyward. The funeral procession itself was a kind of exorcism through motion, a slow weaving of the soul out of the world. In some places, mourners walked counterclockwise around the grave 3 times before leaving, symbolizing the reversal of life's path. In others, the deceased name was spoken backward as the coffin was lowered, ensuring that it could not be called back. Windows were opened to let the spirit out, and mirrors were covered so it would not mistake reflection for life. Each act stemmed from one conviction: death was powerful, but it could be guided. Even the landscape bore traces of this reverence. Villages often placed cemeteries uphill, closer to light, while valleys, damp and misted, were left for those feared or forgotten. Streams running near burial grounds were considered sacred. People avoided washing clothes downstream, believing the water carried whispers. When mist rose from those waters, they said it was the breath of the sleeping earth. Yet despite the fear, there was beauty in this intimacy with death. People lived with constant reminders: skulls carved into church doors, bones displayed on altars, inscriptions, reading times, memento mori asterisk. These were not grim warnings but invitations to gratitude. To remember death was to remember life's fragile holiness. The medieval soul did not separate dread from devotion, it wove them together into reverence. Archaeologists today dig through these layers of belief and find the humanity still intact. A mother buried with her infant, their hands intertwined. A young man laid with a sprig of herbs, perhaps rosemary for remembrance. A broken cross placed gently across a chest. Every precaution, every superstition, was born of love, expressed through fear. The earth, patient and unjudging, keeps these stories. It holds both the careful and the careless, the sanctified and the shunned, without distinction. Beneath the fields where wheat now grows, the old cemeteries still breathe quietly. The dead do not haunt. They wait not in malice, but in memory, as though holding the world steady until it is ready to join them. And as the villagers moved through their days, hearing the bells, passing the churchyard, or catching a glimpse of mist curling above the graves, they carried a shared awareness. The border between worlds was not solid, only sleeping. Soon, that border would quake. For when the plague came, death no longer waited politely underground. It rose and walked among the living, demanding not ceremony, but reckoning. When death wore no face, they tried to name it. It came without warning, without logic, without mercy. One day the bells rang for a neighbor, the next for a family, then for the bell ringer himself. The plague arrived like a rumor that turned real, invisible, but everywhere. People said it moved with the wind, that it crept along rivers, that it rode inside the breath of strangers. No wall could stop it, no prayer could bargain with it. The world did not end in fire or war, but in silence, the kind that follows when an entire village forgets to breathe. At first, they thought it would pass, a fever, a swelling, a punishment meant for others. But soon the roads filled with carts carrying the same story over and over, faces covered, hands tied in cloth, the smell of despair. In towns and hamlets, doors were marked with crosses to warn others away. Inside, candles burned day and night, their wax melting faster than hope. Those who still lived whispered to themselves, counting heartbeats as proof they remained among the breathing. The church's voice, once a pillar of certainty, trembled. Priests walked the streets, swinging censers heavy with smoke, trying to sweeten the air they believed carried death. They blessed wells, rang bells, sprinkled holy water over fields and corpses alike, yet the sickness only spread. When the priests began to die too, the people turned inward, seeking protection wherever it might still be found. Rituals once whispered in secrecy were now performed openly, desperate and defiant. In the fields, villagers lit bonfires at dusk, their glow trembling against the endless night. They believed the flames could frighten the plague away, that the smoke would cleanse what air could not. Whole communities gathered in circles, chanting prayers that mixed Latin with ancient words whose meanings had long been lost but whose sound still carried power. The wind swallowed their voices, but they sang anyway. It was better to fill the dark with noise than to leave it listening. When the dead outnumbered the living, even fear changed shape. People who had once shunned magic now begged for charms. Herbs once dismissed as superstition became treasures. The wise women, those who had survived suspicion and fire, were summoned again. They brewed concoctions of vinegar, garlic, and ash. They burned juniper and rosemary to cleanse the air. Some hung toads by doorways to draw out sickness. Others placed bread in the corners of rooms to distract death with an offering. Every act was both madness and faith, but in that moment, the two were indistinguishable. Cities turned into open graves. Streets once loud with merchants now echoed with footsteps of the few who dared emerge. Masks of wax and linen, stuffed with herbs, became the new faces of survival. Behind them, eyes watched the world dissolve. The dead were carried to pits, buried without name or ritual, the ground too tired to care. Even the earth seemed to grieve, swallowing bodies until it could no longer hold them. The air grew thick with ash, prayer, and the scent of decay, a mixture that made time feel suspended. Those who could fled to the countryside, but the plague followed. It found them in barns, in caves, in forests, where they thought God's breath might still be clean. Children were born and buried in the same week. Lovers slept beside each other, knowing that one might wake alone. Each dawn felt borrowed, each night a negotiation. Yet through it all, something stubborn in the human heart refused to surrender. In one village, a single church bell rang every hour for weeks, even after there was no one left to hear it. Travelers said they saw the rope moving by itself, as if the wind had learned pity. In another, villagers painted crosses not only on doors but on their own skin, turning bodies into living prayers. One farmer dug a trench around his home and filled it with firewood, keeping it lit for 40 days, convinced that light itself was medicine. His family survived, though no one could explain why. Faith fractured and multiplied. Some called the plague God's wrath. Others saw it as the devil's dance. A few believed it was neither, simply the world reminding humanity of its place. But even in despair, ritual endured. Every act of survival became ceremony. A woman burying her husband whispered words she could not remember learning. A boy lighting a candle at midnight felt the weight of every candle ever lit before him. Even grief had its liturgy. Miracles were whispered between tragedies. A monastery untouched while the valley below perished. A blind man who claimed to see angels walking through the fog. A well whose water remained clear when all others turned foul. These stories were both comfort and contagion of another kind, hope, spreading faster than reason. People needed to believe that somewhere, something still listened. Artists who survived painted visions of the apocalypse, skeletons dancing with peasants, angels weighing souls, demons counting the dead. Yet even in these grim images, there was rhythm, almost music. Death was not chaos but choreography. The paintings said what words could not, that life and loss were partners in an endless dance, and that the living, even terrified, still moved in time to it. When the plague finally began to fade, it left behind more than graves. It left silence, a silence too deep for immediate rebuilding. Survivors stepped into a world that felt hollow, as if the echo of prayers had outlasted the voices that spoke them. But in that emptiness, something stirred. People began to gather again, cautiously, in churches and fields, lighting candles not just for the dead, but for themselves. Each flame was a declaration. Asterisk, we remain. Asterisk. The memory of death's reach changed everything. Villagers who once obeyed priests without question now trusted their own rituals again. The church, weakened but unbroken, adapted 2 sanctifying bonfires, blessing herbs, turning old magic into new miracles. The boundary between religion and superstition blurred forever. What mattered was not whose truth it was, but whether it kept the darkness at bay. The world did not truly end, but it had been remade. Those who survived carried the invisible scars of both loss and revelation. They had seen faith stripped of certainty and rebuilt from ashes. They had learned that even when the divine seemed absent, humanity's instinct to create meaning never died. When dawn returned to plague-stricken lands, the air smelled different, cleaner, emptier, aware. Bells rang again, not in panic but in mourning, their echoes drifting across empty valleys like soft reminders that life, once named, refuses to forget itself. And as the smoke cleared, people looked at one another and wondered what they had become and whether the world that followed would ever again believe that death was truly silent. Soon, the story will shift to those who remained the ones who took the silence and turned it into ritual once more, rebuilding not cities or kingdoms, but faith itself. What survived the plague wasn't the body, it was belief. When the bells stopped ringing and the smoke cleared, the world exhaled. The air felt thin, the silence heavier than grief itself. Fields lay empty where laughter once grew. Entire villages had vanished, leaving only foundations and half-buried icons to mark that people had once called those places home. But from the stillness came movement. Slowly, as if waking from a fever dream, the survivors began to walk again, not away from the ruins, but toward meaning. The first to move were the pilgrims. Barefoot, wrapped in wool and exhaustion, they traveled to holy sites as if seeking an answer too large to find in any church. Roads filled with processions of the newly living widows carrying bread, orphans clutching relics, farmers bearing candles carved from their own tallow. They walked in silence, save for the shuffle of feet and the occasional murmur of a psalm. Every step was both confession and resurrection. To move was to declare that the world still existed, and that they were still part of it. The church, battered but enduring, tried to interpret what had happened. Some claimed the plague had been divine punishment, others, a test. Yet among the people, something subtler took root. They had prayed for deliverance and found none, yet they had survived. Faith, once built on certainty, began to evolve into gratitude. The rituals that followed were no longer about defense against unseen forces, but about remembering those who hadn't returned. Fear softened into reverence. In cities where mass graves marked the landscape, new chapels rose atop the mounds. These were not monuments of triumph, but of humility. Bones collected from the earth were arranged in patterns of devotion, skulls forming crosses, femurs framing altars. The dead, once feared, became guardians of the living. People entered these chapels not to beg for protection but to whisper thanks, to acknowledge that life continued because of what had been lost. Relics multiplied. Anything touched by survival gained holiness: a saint's fingerbone, a pilgrim's staff, even a child's shoe found in the ruins of a house. These objects became vessels of collective memory. Pilgrims carried them home wrapped in cloth, placing them near hearths or under beds, as if proximity to remembrance could keep despair from returning. The relics were not worshipped for their power, but for their persistence, proof that something of the sacred had endured the fire. In many regions, the tradition of processional mourning emerged. Once a year, entire communities gathered to walk the paths the plague had followed. They retraced its route not to reopen the wound, but to make peace with it. Along the way, they left garlands, bread, or bowls of milk at crossroads where the dead were buried without names. At dusk, they lit candles and placed them in windows so that no soul, wandering or weary, would ever mistake forgetfulness for peace. These processions, part prayer and part remembrance, became a rhythm of healing that lasted generations. Art, too, changed its voice. Painters who had once depicted saints in gold now painted them with tired eyes and dust on their robes. Sculptors carved angels not triumphant but grieving, wings folded inward as if shielding the fragile light beneath them. Beauty no longer denied suffering, it embraced it. The divine was no longer distant and perfect but close, familiar, human. In this quiet transformation, religion found tenderness again. Even daily life became liturgical. Mothers taught children to pause before meals and touch the bread to their lips in thanks. Farmers began blessing their tools before harvest, not as superstition, but as gratitude for another season alive. Every act of labor became an offering, The rhythm of work and rest turned sacred, echoing the rituals that once tried to keep death away, now reshaped to celebrate endurance. But beneath this gentleness lingered the memory of terror. Survivors carried it in their dreams, in the silence that settled after laughter, in the way they counted family members before sleeping. They could not forget how easily the world had emptied. To them, remembrance was a form of vigilance. Cemeteries became gardens of devotion. People planted herbs known for healing beside the graves, rosemary for remembrance, lavender for peace, rue for protection. Over time, these herbs spread like living prayers, covering the earth that had once swallowed so many. Pilgrimage routes connected villages once isolated by fear. They became veins of shared story, carrying songs, prayers, and the comfort of recognition. Travelers exchanged small relics, a smooth stone from one churchyard, a sprig of dried herbs from another. Each item carried the energy of countless hands. In that circulation, faith became collective again, a shared pulse instead of a solitary plea. The church adjusted to this new humility. Priests began to bless not only people but the homes they lived in, the fields they tended, the animals that kept them alive. The sacred expanded beyond the altar. In sermons, God was no longer portrayed as distant judge, but as companion in endurance. The words mercy and memory began to echo together. Even inquisitors found themselves quieter, uncertain. The plague had humbled the idea of certainty itself. For the first time in generations, women found voices in public faith. The same midwives and healers once accused of witchcraft were sought for wisdom about life, medicine, and grief. Their survival felt miraculous, their knowledge newly sanctified. Some monasteries invited them to share herbal recipes once condemned as heretical, integrating folk practice into formal liturgy. Healing became an act of worship. In this merging of old and new, faith adapted, quietly acknowledging that both body and spirit required tending. Across Europe, people built shrines not to saints but to moments, to the night the fires went out, to the day the bells began to ring again, to the return of birds after a silent spring. Each shrine was personal yet universal, a reminder that the smallest signs could signal renewal. Faith no longer demanded miracles. It found holiness in persistence. One chronicle tells of a village that survived almost untouched. Each year thereafter, on the anniversary of the plague's retreat, they held a feast called Times the Quiet Table *. No one spoke during the meal. Plates were filled and emptied in silence, and afterward, candles were placed in the river to drift downstream. The glow reflected on the water looked like souls traveling toward the sea. It became their annual act of peace, not forgetting, but forgiving. The survivors rebuilt not only their towns but their sense of time. Before the plague, days were marked by labor and prayer. After, they were marked by remembrance. Festivals celebrated not abundance but endurance. Songs grew slower, harmonies softer, as if the world had learned that gentleness was stronger than certainty. And yet, for all its calm, the age that followed held secrets of its own. The lines between faith and magic, church and folk, had blurred too deeply to be untangled. Beneath this new gentleness lay embers knowledge preserved quietly, passed in whispers, guarded by those who remembered the old ways. Because even as the bells returned and the world healed, some began to gather in private: scholars, healers, wanderers, those who still felt that the light of God and the shadow of mystery came from the same flame. Their quiet brotherhoods and sisterhoods would shape the centuries that followed, preserving what could not be spoken aloud. And so, from the ashes of death, rose not only faith renewed, but faith transformed, softer, wiser, secret. Soon, our story will follow those who carried this secret light, the hidden keepers of knowledge, who walked between church and shadow, between miracle and memory. Some secrets didn't die, they changed uniforms. After the plague, the world needed builders, healers, and keepers of order. But beneath those humble trades, something older stirred. Knowledge that had survived fire, faith, and fear found new disguises, hidden not in caves or books this time, but in craft, silence, and service. The age of persecution had ended. The age of secrecy had begun. Across Europe, guilds rose from the ruins. To the eye, they were practical. Stonemasons, carpenters, blacksmiths, craftsmen sworn to rebuild cities and cathedrals. Yet their oaths went deeper than trade. Within their gatherings, the language of measurement and stone carried echoes of older symbols. The compass and square, the circle and triangle tools, yes, but also talismans. To lay stone true was to mirror divine geometry. The builders said that the cathedral was not only for worship, but also for remembrance, a monument to what the world had lost and what it still feared to name. Their meeting halls were plain, but the rituals were precise. Apprentices learned not just craft but conduct, silence before speech, humility before mastery, secrecy before pride. It was said that the guilds carried the last fragments of pre-Christian law, preserved in allegories so subtle that even the church could not object. When asked about their symbols, they smiled and said they were marks of discipline, nothing more. But those who watched closely saw patterns repeat, circles drawn where none were needed, stars etched in mortar, numbers whispered like blessings. Perhaps superstition, perhaps continuity. In the forests, where civilization thinned, other keepers remained the hermits. To the villagers, they were saints or madmen, depending on the story. They lived in caves or abandoned chapels, their only possessions a staff, a cloak, and silence. Yet people still sought them out, bringing bread, wine, and questions. Some hermits offered prayer, others advice cloaked in riddle. It was said that a few carried relics of older faiths, charms of bone, fragments of meteorite, stones inscribed with names forgotten by the church. The hermit's solitude gave them a strange power. They were free from both authority and community, answerable only to the wilderness. Many wrote, though few of their writings survive. Fragments speak of visions in which the forest itself seemed to breathe, of rivers that spoke in dreams. In an age still trembling from death, these hermits embodied survival without witness, faith stripped of audience. To live alone was to listen differently. Among the women, the tradition continued through midwives and healers. Once accused of witchcraft, now they were tolerated, even valued. The church quietly needed them, though it never admitted it. Their understanding of birth, herbs, and the fragile boundary between life and death could not be replicated by prayer alone. So they worked quietly, combining learned medicine with ritual habit. A pinch of salt on the threshold, a whispered word before the first cry, a thread tied around a newborn's wrist, gestures that no priest could sanction, but no one dared forbid. Their houses smelled of smoke and sage. Within, shelves of jars lined the walls, not labeled by name but by symbol. A spiral for cleansing, a cross for healing, a crescent for courage. Knowledge was passed not through writing but through memory, touch, and tone. To teach was to trust, and to trust was rare. Some midwives worked their whole lives before revealing a single secret to a chosen apprentice. To outsiders, this looked like superstition. To them, it was stewardship. Over time, these healers, builders, and hermits became threads in the same hidden fabric. They rarely met, rarely even knew of each other, but they shared a quiet covenant, to keep wisdom alive through form, not proclamation. The mason carved, the hermit wrote, the midwife whispered. Each held a fragment of an ancient whole. If faith had survived persecution, it was through this quiet division of labor, knowledge scattered so widely that it could never again be burned in one place. Some scholars later speculated that these groups were the ancestors of secret orders that would emerge in later centuries, societies of symbols and silence, guardians of forbidden understanding. Whether that is true or not, the resemblance is striking. The oaths of the guilds echo in later codes. The hermit's visions resemble later mystic texts. The midwives' rituals reappear as folk sacraments in hidden Christian sects. Perhaps the lineage is myth, or perhaps myths were the only language secrecy could safely use. In one legend, a circle of stonemasons in France built a chapel with no visible patron. Its carvings depicted not saints but stars, its windows aligned with solstices. Locals called it times La Chapelle des Veilleurs, times the Chapelle of the Watchers. When asked who it honored, the builders said only, those who remember what others forgot. The church blessed it, unaware of the geometry carved beneath the plaster, a pattern that, centuries later, scholars found mirrored in other cathedrals hundreds of miles away. Coincidence, perhaps, or communion. Meanwhile, travelers told of a hermit near Lake Geneva who carved symbols into bark and stone spirals, eyes, circles, intersecting lines. He never spoke, but villagers said his gestures guided storms away from their crops. When he died, they found his cave filled with drawings of constellations and fragments of Latin prayers twisted into new shapes. They called him times the man who spoke to heaven sideways. Asterisk. The church buried him quietly. The midwives, too, left traces. Beneath some rural chapels, excavators have found small wooden boxes containing bones of infants, herbs, and charms, perhaps memorials, perhaps protections for mothers yet to come. The church later sanctified similar practices as relics of innocence, but the timing suggests otherwise. The line between blessing and protection blurred beyond recovery. All these threads, the builder's geometry, the hermit's silence, the healer's herbs, wove a continuity not of doctrine, but of memory. Each generation disguised what it knew in the language of its time. Secrets survived not by defiance, but by disguise. The wisdom that could not be spoken aloud became architecture, medicine, and ritual. Belief learned to hide in plain sight. To the modern mind, such continuity feels improbable. Yet the evidence persists, recurring symbols carved into doorways across centuries. Prayers identical in structure, though separated by distance and time. If this was coincidence, it was a poetic one. If connection, it was genius. Either way, it speaks to humanity's instinct to preserve meaning even when forbidden to name it. Some secrets do not vanish, they adapt. They change shape to fit the age that fears them. In the centuries after the plague, faith turned into geometry, compassion into craft, holiness into habit. The silent orders that followed the guilds, the hermits, the healers kept the sacred alive by giving it new clothing. They were not rebels. They were caretakers, preserving what could no longer be preached. And perhaps they knew that truth, like seed, grows best in darkness. As the world healed, their quiet work continued invisible, unrecorded, yet enduring. Their symbols would later feed legends of brotherhoods and secret societies, tales of hidden archives and invisible hands shaping history. But before myth grew around them, they were simply people who refused to let the light go out. And as this chapter closes, the story turns toward those legends, the distortions and dreams born from these custodians of silence, where memory became myth, and myth began to speak in tongues once again. Every bedtime tale began as a confession. The stories told to children in flickering firelight were not born from whimsy, but from fear that had learned to sing softly. What we now call folklore was once a coded record, the memory of forbidden acts disguised as moral instruction. When belief became dangerous, truth hid inside story. The words that survived were those that could pass as harmless. In the centuries after the plague, when silence had become a form of wisdom, people began to translate their past into fable. The rituals of protection, the bargains made at crossroads, the whispered charms, all were transformed into tales about witches, kings, and creatures of the night. To speak plainly was perilous, but to tell a story was safe, so memory found its refuge in imagination. The fireside became its temple, and language its mask. Take the old tales of the forbidden forest. They warned children not to stray from the path, not to answer when someone called their name from the dark. To modern ears, they sound like lessons in obedience. But their roots are older. The path was the narrow space between the seen and unseen, the boundary villages once marked with salt and prayer. The warning not to stray was not against adventure, but against awakening something forgotten. The forest itself was not evil. It was sacred, unpredictable, alive. Those who entered without permission risked returning changed. Then came the tales of witches, women who brewed storms, spoke to animals, and lived alone. These were not inventions of malice, but echoes of the healers who once tended the sick in secret. Their cauldrons were memory of the herbal pot, their familiars, the spirits of animals, long believed to carry messages between worlds. Over time, their kindness was rewritten as curse, their solitude as sin. Yet the archetype persisted. The wise woman at the edge of the village, feared and sought in equal measure. Through her, the ancient reverence for hidden knowledge endured, disguised as cautionary tale. Monsters, too, were born from remembrance. The vampiric dead, the shapeshifter, the wolf cursed to walk on two legs. These were not simply nightmares, but explanations for the unexplainable. The vampire was the restless soul, the one who could not stay buried. The werewolf, the person transformed by rage, hunger, or guilt. Each creature gave form to emotion too vast for reason. Fear became anatomy. Sin became story. The villagers might have stopped believing in spells, but they still needed symbols to hold the darkness. Even fairy godmothers, those radiant figures who appear in stories to bless or punish, descend from older traditions. They were the household spirits once honored with bread and milk, the invisible allies of hearth and home. When the church replaced them with saints, their gentler aspects slipped into bedtime tales. They became keepers of destiny, granting gifts instead of protection. In this transformation, kindness itself became a kind of magic. Every culture carried its own translations. In the north, the sun was personified as a returning hero. In the south, water spirits guarded wells once sacred to forgotten goddesses. Across Europe, tales converged. The traveler who must never look back, the forbidden door, the price of curiosity. These motifs were not coincidences, but shared fragments of survival, inherited instincts retold in new tongues. When people forgot the rituals that once kept them safe, the stories remembered for them. Children grew up hearing them, never knowing they were learning an older language. Don't step off the path meant respect the boundary. Don't eat the stranger's food meant beware of bargains. Don't wander alone at night meant the world still listens. Every warning hid and sobbed. Ancient whisper that unseen forces require acknowledgement, not defiance. The tales taught humility before mystery. As centuries passed, the stories grew gentler, the edges of dread softened by time. They became entertainment rather than instruction, yet traces of their origin remained. The fairy tales collected by scholars in the 18th and 19th centuries still carried faint echoes of ritual. The enchanted sleep, the cursed spindle, the bargain sealed with blood. What once was a manual for survival became a mirror for the imagination, reflecting, in safer form, our timeless longing to outwit fate. The storytellers themselves became inheritors of forgotten priesthoods. Minstrels, grandmothers, monks, each shaped the material to suit their audience. A monk might frame an ancient pagan myth as a Christian parable. A mother might soften its cruelty into metaphor. Yet beneath the revisions, the pulse of the original remained. Story was the memory that refused erasure. When the written word could be censored, the spoken word could travel free. In some places, stories were still performed as ritual. At midsummer, villagers reenacted battles between light and darkness. At harvest, they told tales of spirits guarding the crops. These performances kept the past alive without inviting accusation. To dance, to sing, to tell these became acts of remembrance disguised as celebration. The world learned that truth could survive best when dressed in joy. Anthropologists, centuries later, would look back and call these transformations myth-making, but to those who lived through them, it was healing. After so much loss, the human mind sought pattern, story, meaning. The tale was therapy for the collective soul, a way of holding pain without being broken by it. Through fable, they reimagined fear as lesson, sorrow as origin. Even nightmares became useful. They taught what the daylight could not explain. The boundaries between myth and memory blurred until they were one. Perhaps that was the point. The mind, too, is a kind of storyteller, turning chaos into sequence, accident into fate. When the world seemed senseless, narrative restored order. The villagers did not need to know whether the stories were true. They needed only to believe that they times had time's meaning. And meaning, in the end, was the truest magic of all. Sometimes, at the end of a tale, the storyteller would pause, letting the silence between words carry more weight than the story itself. That silence was the echo of what had been lost. The listeners felt it even if they couldn't name it, the pull of ancient memory hiding beneath familiar shapes. In that pause, history and myth touched hands. Every bedtime tale, then, was a map, not to treasure, but to truth, buried beneath centuries of retelling. We may never uncover the original rituals that inspired them, the real crossroads, the true incantations, the faces of those who first whispered the words, but perhaps that is what keeps them alive. Mystery is a kind of oxygen for belief. Without it, stories suffocate. And so the myths endured, drifting across time like embers, glowing just enough to remind humanity that wonder once saved it. What began as survival became song. What began as secrecy became imagination. Even now, when we tell these tales to children before sleep of wolves, witches, and wishes, we are reenacting the oldest protection spell of all, to speak light into darkness, to turn fear into story, to remember without knowing we are remembering. Because somewhere within every legend still lies a heartbeat, not of fiction, but of history disguised. And as the fire burns low and the story fades, we begin to see the bridge forming, from myth to modern life, where the same symbols whisper in new languages. Soon, the tale will step quietly into our own time, to show how even now, in the glow of screens and cities, the ancient stories still watch us and still wait to be believed. We call them habits now, but they were once spells. When we touch wood, cross our fingers, or whisper a quick wish before a journey, we are repeating gestures older than memory. What feels like instinct is actually inheritance, the residue of 1,000 years of fear turned into comfort. The medieval world may have faded, but its rituals never really died. They simply changed names, disguising themselves as manners, customs, or luck. Consider the phrase asterisk, knock on wood. Asterisk. It feels casual, almost playful, something we say without thinking, a charm against tempting fate. But in the Middle Ages, people knocked on trees to awaken the spirits that lived within them, asking protection from misfortune. Certain oaks and beeches were thought to house benevolent presences, ancient guardians who could listen, though they rarely spoke. Over time, the spirits became symbols, the trees became furniture, and the prayer became a phrase. Yet the impulse remains. We still seek reassurance in sound, in touch, in the rhythm of something solid answering back. Crossing fingers, too, once meant more than hope. In the centuries after the plague, when suspicion and faith collided, two people would cross their index fingers together while making a wish, forming the symbol of the Christian cross in miniature. It was a secret signal, a way to invoke divine witness without speaking aloud. Later, the gesture shrank to one hand, the partner imagined rather than present, the faith replaced by habit. Still, when we cross our fingers before exams or news, we're invoking that same partnership with the unseen, a contract of chance made sacred through touch. Even the act of saying asterisk, bless you, asterisk, after a sneeze, carries the shadow of panic. During outbreaks of plague, sneezing was one of the first signs of infection. People blessed one another instinctively, hoping that words could build a wall between life and death. The phrase lingered long after its context vanished. Today it's politeness, not protection, yet the rhythm is the same, a verbal shield, soft and automatic, as if speech itself could keep danger at bay. In medieval homes, people slept with a candle burning near the bed, believing the flame frightened away restless spirits. When wax grew costly, the custom shifted to prayer instead, a whispered invocation before sleep. Centuries later, that habit still flickers at the edge of modern life. Now I lay me down to sleep, says the child's rhyme, echoing those ancient fears of night's return. We no longer imagine demons crouching by the hearth, but we still acknowledge the fragility of closing our eyes. The ritual endures because it soothes the same old question: who will watch while we dream? Lucky charms, too, are ghosts of older magic. The horseshoe above a doorway once trapped malicious spirits, its iron poisonous to anything unholy. Today it's decoration, polished brass replacing rusted metal, the story remembered, but softened. Carrying a rabbit's foot was once an appeal to fertility gods, the luck of the animal transferred through bone. Tossing salt over the left shoulder came from medieval kitchens, where spilled salt, a precious commodity, was considered an omen of discord. Throwing it behind you was a symbolic distraction, feeding the devil before he could whisper mischief. We still do it, half laughing, half sincere. Old superstitions survive best when disguised as jokes. Mirrors, too, hold their quiet legacy. In earlier centuries, glass was rare and costly, a luxury that seemed to hold more than reflection. People believed mirrors captured fragments of the soul. Breaking one meant damaging the spirit's image, and the 7 years of bad luck came from the idea that it took 7 years for the soul to heal itself. Even now, when a mirror cracks, something inside us flinches, not from reason, but from recognition. Wedding traditions shimmer with forgotten charms. The white dress for purity, the veil to ward off envy, the bouquet thrown to carry blessings forward. Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue, once served as a list of protections. Old for continuity, new for renewal, borrowed for luck, blue for truth. The rhyme is cheerful now, its origins buried beneath lace, but it still hums with the old rhythm of ritual, the need to begin sacred things with balance. Even the architecture around us carries quiet remnants of fear. Door knockers shaped like lions, gargoyles perched on rooftops, and small crosses etched above windows, all descended from medieval apotropaic symbols, meant to frighten evil away. We admire them now for their beauty, unaware that they were once guardians. Our cities are museums of superstition, their bricks laid by hands that believed walls could pray. Modern life, for all its logic, has not escaped the pull of the unseen. Athletes wear the same socks for every victory. Actors whisper, "break a leg," instead of "good luck." Travelers avoid certain seats or numbers on flights. These rituals have lost their theology, but kept their purpose, to give shape to uncertainty. The human mind, ancient and adaptive, still seeks patterns where none exist, comfort where reason cannot reach. We like to imagine we have outgrown the medieval imagination, that our fears are different now, but the same forces linger, only renamed. Fortune has replaced fate. Coincidence stands in for miracle. Our machines may have tamed the dark, yet we still glance over our shoulders when alone, still touch familiar objects before important moments, still whisper to no one in particular. Asterisk, please. Asterisk. Rationality has not erased ritual. It has only dressed it in new clothes. Science explains the why, but ritual soothes the what if. The two have never truly been enemies, only different ways of making sense of chaos. The medieval peasant who buried iron at his threshold, and the modern commuter who checks the lock twice before bed, share the same instinct, control borrowed from repetition. To act, even symbolically, is to push back against the void. Perhaps that is why these gestures endure. They are the small survivals of awe-proof that even now, in a world of logic and light, we still crave the quiet comfort of magic. When we knock, cross, or bless, we are speaking to the same uncertainty that haunted our ancestors. And though the language has softened, the need remains. We call them habits, but they are memory disguised as behavior, the hand remembering what the heart has forgotten. Through them, we carry fragments of those who came before us, their hopes, their fears, their desperate tenderness toward a world that could not be controlled. Every superstition is a footprint, a whisper of the old survival songs that taught us how to live with mystery instead of trying to destroy it. If you listen carefully, you can still hear those songs in the hum of daily life, in the clink of a glass before a toast, in the pause before a wish, in the shared laughter after an omen is averted. The world hums with the echoes of rituals that refuse to die. And soon, our story will follow those echoes into the present, into the strange resurgence of the mystical, where the ancient hunger for meaning stirs again beneath the glow of screens and the hum of electricity. Because for all our progress, we are still creatures of superstition, still reaching, still hoping, still whispering to the dark. Asterisk. Just in case. Asterisk. The old magic returned wearing modern skin, not through spells whispered in the dark or smoke curling through thatched roofs, but through yoga studios, meditation apps, and candle-lit rituals shared on glowing screens. The words changed, the symbols softened, but the longing remained the same. Humanity, having circled the arc of reason and science, found itself gazing again into mystery, this time without shame. Across the world, people began to seek what their ancestors never truly lost: connection. The air grew heavy with questions that data could not answer. What does it mean to be alive? How do we find peace in a world that never stops moving? And so, like their forebears centuries before, the new seekers turned inward, not to escape reality, but to rediscover it. Witchcraft, once a sentence of death, became a language of empowerment. Young women and men began tracing lunar phases, mixing herbs, lighting candles not out of superstition but symbolism. A jar of salt became a boundary. A cup of tea became a spell for calm. They called it manifestation, intention, or energy work, but the roots stretched far below the surface. These gestures were the descendants of the same ancient rhythm, the belief that the invisible could be spoken to through action. Meanwhile, mindfulness, a word that feels new yet is older than civilization, spread like quiet fire. People learned to breathe again, to sit with silence, to name their fears without exercising them. Psychology called it healing. The ancients might have called it prayer. When we close our eyes and return to stillness, we are performing an act our ancestors practiced beneath stars, long before cities learned to hum. The world's wisdom traditions, Buddhist, Christian, pagan, indigenous, all whispered the same truth. To pause is to listen, and listening is the beginning of magic. The pandemic years, when isolation became universal, accelerated this rediscovery. Trapped indoors, humanity met itself again. Candles flickered beside laptops. Tarot decks reappeared in drawers once reserved for documents. Astrology, dismissed for decades, found new believers. People no longer asked the stars to control their fate, only to remind them of pattern and perspective. The sky became a map for empathy, a way to see oneself as part of something vast and shared. But behind the crystals and horoscopes, something deeper stirred, a recognition that ritual, whatever its form, is medicine for the anxious mind. Science confirms what old magic always knew: repetition soothes, symbol anchors, focus heals. The spell was never in the object, it was in the intention. A witch lighting a candle and a psychologist teaching breath awareness are siblings separated by centuries, both teaching that attention transforms experience. The new seekers do not gather in temples but in digital circles. Their covens are chat groups, their altars portable: a shelf, a phone background, a quiet moment before dawn. They read ancient texts alongside neuroscience studies. They blend the language of energy with that of trauma and recovery. It is not delusion, it is adaptation. When traditional religion failed to speak to the fractured soul of the modern world, people built their own bridges, fragile, personal, yet sincere. And in those bridges, something beautiful happened. The fear that once shrouded forbidden knowledge turned into curiosity. The witch became healer again, the astrologer philosopher, the dreamer a scientist of the psyche. History's heretics became guides for mindfulness workshops and eco-spiritual retreats. The language of sin gave way to the language of self-discovery. The sacred returned, not through fire and scripture, but through curiosity and care. Still, traces of the old suspicion linger. Some scoff at crystals and meditation, calling them illusions for the lost. But perhaps it is better to be lost with wonder than to wander without it. The human brain is wired for story, for connection between seen and unseen. When we meditate, pray, or make art, we are using the same ancient circuitry that once shaped rituals in forest and cave. The tools differ. The impulse remains identical, to give mystery a shape gentle enough to touch. In this new age of reason, belief became private, interior, self-tailored, each person a pilgrim designing their own shrine. For some, it is nature hiking as communion, rivers as confession. For others, it is therapy, poetry, or the quiet act of breathing through pain. None of these are contradictions to science, they are extensions of it. To know the mechanics of the mind does not destroy wonder, it refines it. The old magic has simply changed accent, speaking now through psychology, ecology, and art. Artists became modern mystics. Painters explored sacred geometry without using the word sacred. Musicians looped tones that mirrored the drones of medieval chant. Filmmakers used light as metaphor for soul. Every creative act became a ritual of remembrance, proof that imagination, once feared, still carries the power to heal. The new seekers are not escaping the past, they are reconciling with it. They honor ancestors not through genealogies but through empathy, by understanding their fears, their rituals, their desperate tenderness toward existence. They see superstition not as ignorance but as poetry. A charm against the dark becomes, in modern terms, an affirmation of resilience. To light a candle for focus is not to reject science, but to honor the continuity of care. In a world where information floods every moment, silence itself has become sacred again. People retreat into meditation retreats, sound baths, forest walks, modern monasteries of presence. The language is new, but the purpose remains, to remember what stillness feels like. Somewhere, in that pause, the same quiet that once filled cathedrals and groves returns not as doctrine, but as breath. Perhaps that is the final evolution of faith, not belief in gods, but in continuity. In the idea that every hand reaching for meaning, whether clutching a rosary, a tarot card, or a heartbeat, is part of the same human lineage of seeking. The medieval villager who whispered to the well, and the modern soul who journals by candlelight, are not opposites. They are reflections separated by time. The old magic was never buried. It waited. And when the modern world grew too loud, too fractured, too certain, it returned soft, spoken, adaptive, clothed in mindfulness and self-care. It no longer promised miracles. It offered awareness. It no longer demanded obedience. It invited participation. This was not regression, but reconciliation, a circle closing gently upon itself. Now, at night, as people burn incense beside computer screens, listen to ambient chants through headphones, and whisper affirmations instead of prayers, the unseen feels near again, not threatening, but tender. The same force that once turned herbs to medicine and words to protection now moves through playlists, guided breathing, and quiet acts of kindness. The sacred has learned to dwell comfortably in the ordinary. And so the new seekers walk familiar paths in new shoes. They do not build cathedrals or light pyres. They build practices. They do not fear the dark. They befriend it. They look backward not to worship the past, but to learn its patience. Because in remembering, they heal the rupture between ancient awe and modern understanding. Soon, this reflection will draw to its final flame, to a candle still burning after centuries of doubt, where we'll look not at rituals or relics, but at what they reveal about us, that beneath every age, belief, and disguise, humanity's oldest instinct remains the same, to find meaning in the mystery, and peace in the act of remembering. Perhaps the darkness was never the enemy, only the reminder. It reminded the old world to pause, to gather close, to listen. Night was not only the absence of light, but the presence of everything else, of memory, of fear, of quiet. The people who lived beneath its weight did not take it for granted. They honored it, negotiated with it, feared it, and through that fear, found reverence. We, who have banished so much of the dark, rarely remember what it meant to live inside mystery. The medieval villagers, we followed their rituals, their charms, their whispered prayers, lived at the mercy of forces they could neither see nor control. They feared plague, hunger, spirits, and silence. Yet inside that fear was awareness, a constant acknowledgement that life was fragile, borrowed, sacred. Every flickering flame, every dawn, was a small victory. They did not divide the world into the living and the dead, sacred and ordinary. Everything was part of the same trembling continuum. We, their descendants, have inherited their fear, but not their rituals. We still seek protection, but our protections are invisible. Passwords, alarms, insurance, medicine. We build walls of data and concrete and call them safety. Yet the same unease lingers, that sense that something vast moves beyond our reach, something unmeasured by screens or schedules. The difference is that they named it, spoke to it, tried to live alongside it. We have forgotten the language, and so it haunts us in silence. The darkness they feared has not vanished. It has only changed address. It lives now in the quiet spaces between our thoughts, in the sleepless hours, when the house hums with electricity and the glow of devices replaces candlelight. We stare into screens instead of flames, seeking comfort in patterns of light, just as they once did. But the light we've created asks nothing of us. It does not listen. It does not reply. Once, the ritual of night was shared. Families gathered around the hearth, telling stories not to entertain but to remember who they were. Firelight stitched faces together, making community visible. When the fire burned low, so did the voices, and silence became prayer. Now, our nights are solitary, fractured by artificial light that never ends. The ancient rhythm of darkness and dawn, that pulse of vulnerability and renewal, has been replaced by a hum of constant brightness. And in that brightness, something has been lost, the humility of not knowing. The people who feared the dark were, in a way, wiser than we are. Their fear taught them to listen to the earth, to their dreams, to each other. They lived surrounded by reminders that they were not the center of creation. The river could flood, the field could fail, the wind could change. They respected those forces because they understood dependence. Today, we mistake control for wisdom. We call ourselves free of superstition, yet we remain bound to the same need for meaning. We just hide it behind rational names. Perhaps what they called faith was simply intimacy, a relationship with the unknown that required participation rather than explanation. They believed not because they understood, but because they cared enough to keep asking. Their rituals were not about certainty, they were about continuity. Every charm, every blessing, every whispered prayer was a thread binding the visible to the unseen, and when fear came, they pulled on that thread and found connection instead of isolation. We too crave that connection. We light candles for ambience, not sanctity, but something ancient stirs in the act. We meditate, not realizing we are repeating the breath patterns of monks. We keep mementos on desks, photos in lockets, small talismans in pockets, echoes of relics once carried against misfortune. These are our modern amulets, stripped of belief but not of purpose. Even without the language of magic, we still practice its grammar. There is tenderness in that continuity. It means the human story never really breaks, it only changes accent. The fear that drove them to whisper charms beneath the moon is the same that drives us to lock our doors and check our hearts for comfort. We still search for protection, for forgiveness, for signs that the universe notices. We call it mindfulness, therapy, spirituality, luck, but beneath every modern name is the same old longing to be seen by something greater than ourselves. The old world's fear of darkness gave rise to light, both literal and spiritual, but perhaps our world, drenched in artificial day, could learn again to value shadow. Darkness has its own wisdom. It softens the edges of certainty, invites reflection, restores the dignity of the unknown. The villagers feared what might emerge from it. We fear what we might find within it. Yet both fears lead to the same truth, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to face it as part of life. Imagine standing in that medieval night again, the fields wide and quiet, the stars shockingly bright. You would feel small, but not insignificant. You would hear the creak of trees, the hush of wind through wheat, and realize that silence is not emptiness, but conversation slowed to its gentlest pace. The world, even then, was speaking. We just had more patience to listen. We have gained much medicine, comfort, understanding, but perhaps lost a way of seeing. The people who looked into the dark saw not only danger, but mystery. They believed that even suffering had meaning if woven into ritual. We often seek to erase suffering, to anesthetize it. They tried to translate it. And in that translation, they created beauty, songs, prayers, stories that outlived their fear. What would it mean to live that way again, not to return to superstition, but to relearn awe, to let the wind, the stars, the silence remind us of our smallness, without shame? The old world bowed to the invisible because it had to. We could choose to. Reverence does not require religion, only attention. And attention, in its purest form, is love. The darkness, then, was never punishment. It was invitation. It asked humanity to listen, to imagine, to create. It tested us, and in doing so, taught us empathy for the fragile, for the unseen, for the living and the dead alike. When the villagers buried their fears in charms and stories, they weren't escaping life. They were learning how to bear it. They turned dread into ritual, ritual into memory, and memory into meaning. Perhaps that is what we have forgotten most, not the rituals themselves, but the courage to make them. The courage to face uncertainty with tenderness instead of denial. To meet the dark not with defiance, but with curiosity. Because maybe the darkness was never the enemy. It was the mirror. And now, as we near the final candle of this long journey from fear to faith, from silence to story, we can look into that mirror and see ourselves reflected across the centuries. The same eyes searching, the same hands trembling, the same fragile light still burning. Soon, that light will fade into the quiet of the epilogue, a silence, not of loss, but of peace. The story will not end. It will rest, the way all rituals do, waiting to be remembered again, when the next generation dares to look into the dark and call it sacred.